Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The shelf that rearranges itself. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, for the most part, was measured in units of 2,500 characters. That was the standard page rate for translation, the tidy digital container into which I poured the sprawling, chaotic syntax of English, reforging it into the precise, elegant structures of Japanese. My apartment in the Kamijo ward of Kyoto was an extension of this philosophy. It was a small, tatami-mat space, my sanctuary of order against the entropy of the world. Books stood in rigid hierarchies, pens lay in parallel formation on my desk, and my schedule was a metronome of work, sleep, and the occasional, meditative walk along the Kamo River. The heart of my apartment, its anchor and its altar, was the bookshelf. It was a dark, imposing piece of Meiji-era cherry wood, inherited from my grandfather. It groaned under the weight of my tools, the Kenkyusha dictionaries, the specialized glossaries for medical and engineering texts, the dog-eared style guides. On the top shelves, less frequently disturbed, lived my personal collection, the novels of Mishima and Kawabata, and a small, cherished row of translated works I admired, a reminder of the art behind the craft. It was here, in this fortress of logic and order, that the first crack appeared. It was a Tuesday. I had spent the day wrestling with a particularly dense manual for a German-made industrial centrifuge. My brain felt like a wrung-out cloth. As I got up to make tea, my eyes swept across the bookshelf, a familiar, comforting sight. Except, it wasn't quite right. My paperback copy of Haruki Murakami's The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, its spine creased from a dozen readings, was on the second shelf, nestled between a guide to classical Japanese grammar and a history of the Sengoku period. I stopped, kettle in hand. That wasn't right. The Wind-Up Bird lived on the third shelf, with the other modern fiction. It always had. I walked over and picked it up. The paper was cool against my fingertips. I could feel the ghost of a memory, placing it on the third shelf just last week after dusting. My brow furrowed. Tired eyes, I told myself. You moved it and forgot. Too much centrifuge terminology. I placed it back in its rightful spot on the third shelf, the slight pressure of slotting it between its neighbors a small act of restoring order. I dismissed it. It was a cognitive hiccup, a stray signal in a fatigued brain. Nothing more. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was my primary stack of dictionaries on the lowest, most accessible shelf. The Kojian was on top of the Daijuin. It was a small thing, but I was a creature of habit. The Daijuin, with its slightly wider binding, always served as the foundation. I stacked them by size. I always had. Strange, I murmured to the empty room. Again, I corrected it. Again, I rationalized. I must have been in a hurry, pulling one out from the middle and replacing them in the wrong order. It was plausible. My recent workload had been relentless. Deadlines loomed like storm clouds, and my sleep had become a shallow, restless thing. It was stress. It had to be. My apartment, once a place of serene predictability, began to feel subtly off-key. A quiet dissonance hummed just beneath the surface of my perception. I would walk into my small kitchen and feel a flicker of disorientation, as if a cup had been moved a centimeter to the left. I'd sit at my desk and find my favorite pen, a Pilot High-Tech C 0.3 mm, on the wrong side of the monitor. Each instance was so minor, so maddeningly plausible, that to dwell on it felt like a slide into neurosis. My own memory was becoming the prime suspect. I was meticulously documenting the words of others while failing to accurately record my own simple actions. The irony was not lost on me. I started making a joke of it, a private ritual to ward off the growing unease. Ah, the Tsukumagami are getting restless today, I'd say to the air. Referencing the old folklore of household objects gaining a spirit, a kami, after 100 years of service. My bookshelf was certainly old enough. Perhaps it had finally woken up and decided it had better ideas about interior design. It was a flimsy shield, but it was better than confronting the alternative, that I was losing my grip. The shield shattered on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The world outside was a gray watercolor wash, rain tracing silver threads down my windowpane. I was in the kitchen alcove, waiting for water to boil for suncha, my back mostly to the main room. The apartment was silent save for the drumming of the rain and the gentle hiss of the electric kettle. In the periphery of my left eye, I saw my living space as a familiar blur of wood, paper, and cream-colored walls. And then, motion. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't a tremor from a passing truck. On the second shelf, a small ceramic tanuki statue, a plump and cheerful raccoon dog I used as a paperweight for loose notes, moved. It slid. A smooth, silent, deliberate glide of about 5 centimeters to the left, as if pushed by an invisible finger. It came to a perfect, soft stop. My breath hitched. The hiss of the kettle faded into a roar in my ears. I whipped my head around so fast my neck twinged. The tanuki was perfectly still, its cheeky, baked-on smile mocking me from its new position. Nothing else in the room had moved. The air was heavy, inert. There was no rational explanation. No vibration, no slanted surface, no breeze. It had simply shifted. The laws of physics, the bedrock of reality on which I had built my orderly life, suddenly felt like a thin sheet of ice. And I had just seen the first hairline crack spread across its surface. My tea was forgotten. I crept towards the bookshelf, half expecting the books to start fluttering like startled birds. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the tanuki. It was solid. Cold ceramic. An ordinary object in an impossible place. This, I could not dismiss. This was not a memory lapse. I had seen it. A furtive, impossible movement in the corner of my eye. The quiet contagion had begun, and my sanctuary was ground zero. From that day on, I lived with a new, secret tension. The apartment was no longer a passive space. It was an active participant in some silent, incomprehensible game. The changes remained small, confined to my home, but they were persistent. The 3 identical Muji gel pens on my desk, once arranged in a simple row, would be rearranged by their ink levels, from fullest to emptiest. The teacups in my cupboard, which I always stored rim down, would find rim up. Each discovery was a small, cold shock. It felt like an intrusion, a violation not of my property, but of my reality. Someone, or something, was tidying my life with a logic that was utterly alien to me. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't destructive. It was, in its own way, orderly. But it wasn't my order. I began a new ritual. Every morning before leaving for a walk, and every night before going to bed, I would take a photograph of the bookshelf with my phone. I'd photograph my desk, my kitchen counter, the small alcove where I kept my shoes. It felt insane, like a parody of a paranoid detective, but I needed proof. I needed to know if I was the one moving things, or if the world itself was moving around me. I needed an external, objective witness to my own sanity. The first time I compared the photos, my stomach twisted into a knot. The morning photo showed a stack of reference books on my desk, ordered A, B, C. The evening photo, taken after a day spent entirely inside my apartment, showed them ordered C, A, B. I hadn't touched them. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I had not touched them. The photograph was my witness, and its testimony was damning. The world was changing, one book, one pen, one teacup at a time. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The photographs became my gospel and my curse. They were irrefutable proof, a timeline of the quiet siege being laid against my reality. The bookshelf was the clear epicenter, its wooden shelves a stage for a constant creeping ballet of rearrangement. But the phenomenon was bleeding outwards, staining the rest of my small world. One Monday, I found that the spines of all my Kawabata novels were facing inwards, presenting a uniform wall of cream-colored pages to the room. It was an aesthetic choice, perhaps, but a deeply unsettling one. It was as if the shelf had decided to turn its back on me. The next day, the remote control for my air conditioner, which I always left on the small table by my futon, was sitting perfectly balanced atop my television. The change was no longer just about reordering, it was about wrongness. It was a meticulous, patient rewriting of my environment, and the new prose was gibberish. The isolation, once a comfortable feature of my freelance life, began to feel like a prison cell. I needed to tell someone. I needed another pair of eyes to validate what mine were seeing. My most regular human contact was Mr. Tanaka, a polite, middle-aged project manager from a Tokyo-based publisher. We communicated mostly through email, but once a month we had a video call to discuss ongoing projects. I decided to try. The call connected, his face appearing in a small, pixelated box on my screen, a generic office behind him. We talked about the centrifuge manual, about a new contract for a series of academic essays. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to sound casual, breezy. "Tanaka-san," I began, forcing a small laugh. "This is going to sound strange, but have you ever felt like your house has a mind of its own? Like things move?" He smiled, a patient, professional smile. "Ah, Ika-san, working too hard. The mind plays tricks when it's tired. You should take a holiday. Visit an onsen. My wife and I went to Hakone last month. Very relaxing." His dismissal was so gentle, so absolute, that it felt more damning than outright mockery. He had taken my flickering ember of terror and neatly, kindly, snuffed it out. To him, it wasn't a possibility to be considered, it was a symptom to be treated. A holiday. An onsen. The mundane cures for a mundane problem. How could I possibly respond? "No, you don't understand, my Tanuki statue is practicing teleportation and my bookshelf is developing a personality." I would sound certifiably insane. "Yes," I said, the word tasting like ash. "You're right. I'm just tired." The conversation moved on, but I had my answer. I was alone in this. The world outside my window, the world of Tanaka-san and his holiday in Hakone, was functioning normally. To try and bridge the gap between his reality and mine was impossible. Feeling trapped, I forced myself to go on longer and more frequent walks, desperate to ground myself in the solid, unchanging reality of Kyoto. The city had always been my anchor, its ancient stones a testament to permanence. But the contagion, I soon discovered, was not confined to my apartment. It was seeping through the walls, through the very streets. It happened near the Kitano Tenmangu Shrine. There was a small, family-run bakery on a side street, a place I'd been going to for years. Their logo was a cheerful cartoon baker holding a baguette, painted on a wooden sign above the door. The baker wore a tall, white chef's hat. I knew this sign. I had looked at it 100 times. But on this day, the hat was blue. I stopped dead in the middle of the pavement, a cyclist swerving around me with an annoyed hiss. It was a bright, sky blue. A color that felt screamingly, fundamentally wrong. My memory, sharp and crystalline, insisted on a white hat. Pure, flower-dusted white. My breath grew shallow. Was this another trick? Had my mind retroactively painted the hat white all these years? I had to know. I walked into the shop, the familiar smell of yeast and sugar doing little to calm my racing heart. Mrs. Sato, the baker's wife, was wiping down the counter. She smiled at me, her face a constellation of familiar, friendly wrinkles. "Ika-chan." The usual Anpan. "Sato-san," I said, my voice tight. "Did you get a new sign?" I noticed the baker's hat is blue now. She paused her wiping and looked at me, her head tilted in genuine confusion. New sign? No, no. We've had that sign since my husband's father opened the shop. She chuckled. And the hat, it's always been blue, Ike-chan. Blue like the morning glories in summer. Her certainty was a physical blow. It was so simple, so unshakable. In the face of it, my own conviction felt flimsy, hysterical. I bought my anpan, thanked her, and walked out, the world feeling tilted on its axis. Was my memory so corruptible? Or was reality itself being patched and updated, with only me seeing the changelog? That night, I started the journal. It was a simple, grid-lined notebook from Muji. I began not just with photos, but with sketches. I drew the exact layout of my desk. I documented the precise angle of the books on my shelf. I wrote down the date, the time, and the anomaly. Item, ceramic tanuki. Change, moved 5 centimeters left. Time, 15:02. Item, bakery sign. Change, baker's hat color from white to blue. My memory is certain it was white. Mrs. Sato claims it has always been blue. The journal became my only confidant. It was a catalogue of a quiet, meticulous apocalypse that only I could see. I took to walking the city with a new, feverish intensity, not for grounding, but for evidence. And I found it everywhere. A stone lantern in the small park near my apartment, which had always faced the path, was now rotated 5 degrees towards a ginkgo tree. The intricate swirl on the manhole covers on my street, a design of a cartwheel, now had an extra spoke. These were details so granular, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the mundane, that no one else would ever notice or care. Pointing it out would be like screaming that a single blade of grass in a field had changed color. It was a lonely, terrifying omniscience. Amidst this personal crisis, my work continued. I took on a new, challenging project, translating a dense, obscure text from the late Heian period, a manuscript recently acquired by a university in California. It was titled Senai no Chijo, or the Geography of Transference. The prose was archaic, the concepts esoteric. It was a treatise on Onmyoto, the ancient Japanese cosmology of yin and yang and the 5 elements, but specifically as it applied to city planning. The author, a long-forgotten court mystic, wrote of the capital as a living entity, built upon a grid of ryumayaku, dragon veins, or lines of force. He spoke of harmonious placement, arguing that the precise alignment of buildings, gates, and even stones could channel this energy for the prosperity and stability of the empire. Conversely, he warned that if the grid were disturbed, if the true name of a location were forgotten or altered, reality itself could become pliable. The world could suffer from spatial incongruities and perceptual drift. At first, it was just a job, another set of characters to be decoded and rendered into sensible English. But the language of the text began to haunt me. Pliable reality. Spatial incongruities. The words echoed the secret entries in my journal. I started working late into the night, driven by a new urgency that had nothing to do with the deadline. I found old maps of Heiankyo, the original name for Kyoto, and began tracing the ryumayaku the author described. I cross-referenced them with modern satellite maps, my screen a chaotic web of ancient energy lines laid over contemporary streets. One night, my blood ran cold. I drew a prominent line described in the text, one that ran from the site of the old Suzaku Gate, through the palace grounds, and straight through the modern-day district of Kamijo. I zoomed in, my hand trembling as I guided the mouse. The line passed directly through my building. It bisected my apartment, slicing through the very spot where my grandfather's bookshelf stood. The bookshelf wasn't the epicenter. It wasn't the source. It was a conduit. An antenna, placed perfectly on a 1,000-year-old line of power, humming with an energy that was warping the world around me. And the text I was translating, the words I was meticulously bringing to life, felt less like a history and more like an instruction manual. I wasn't just reading about a pliable reality. I had the unnerving suspicion that I was helping to create one. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the Ryumayaku changed everything. My fear, once a formless, creeping dread, now had a shape. A name. It was the ancient, esoteric geometry of the city itself, and I was living on one of its fault lines. The Heian text was no longer just a project, it became my Rosetta Stone for the madness. I became obsessed, my waking hours consumed by translating its cryptic passages and cross-referencing them with my own terrifying observations. The author wrote of nodal points where the Ryumayaku were strongest, temples, ancient trees, the confluence of rivers. The changes I documented in my journal began to form a pattern, clustering around these very points. A torii gate near the Kumo River whose red paint seemed a shade too bright one day. A paving stone in the courtyard of Tuji Temple that appeared to be made of a different kind of granite. It was as if someone were slowly, subtly renovating the city along these invisible pathways, and my apartment was a key junction box in the new network. The anomaly, powered by this newfound understanding, seemed to gain strength. It escalated beyond passive rearrangement. The warping became more aggressive, more personal. One morning, I walked into my kitchen and my mind fractured. The sink was where the stove should be. The small refrigerator was on the opposite wall. The entire layout was a perfect mirror image of itself. I reached for a mug on a shelf that wasn't there, my hand grasping at empty air. A wave of vertigo washed over me, so profound I had to brace myself against the doorframe, my knuckles white. My muscle memory, the thousands of unconscious movements that defined my daily routine, was suddenly useless. It was like trying to walk in a world where gravity had changed direction. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When I opened them again, a minute or a lifetime later, the kitchen was back to normal. The sink was in its rightful place. But the ghost of that wrongness, the sensory whiplash, left me trembling for an hour. This was no longer a quiet, academic curiosity. It was dangerous. The world was not just changing, it was testing me, actively trying to unmoor me from my own senses. Desperate for a human anchor, I plunged into the deepest corners of the internet. I searched for forums on esoteric history, urban exploration, and paranormal sightings in Kyoto. I waded through endless posts about ghost stories and tourist traps until I found it, a small, obscure message board dedicated to the study of Onmyoto and its lingering influence on the city. There, buried in a thread about anomalous architecture, was a post by a user named Kitsune Mask. The post was terse, almost coded. Anyone else noticing perceptual shifts in the northern wards? Spatial incongruities. Things not being where they ought to be. My breath caught in my throat. Spatial incongruities. The exact phrase from the Heian text. The exact term for my mirrored kitchen. With shaking hands, I crafted a reply. I was cautious, revealing nothing specific, only that I had observed similar phenomena, and was researching historical precedents. Kitsune Mask replied within the hour. The messages that followed were a torrent of shared experience. He, or she, spoke of seeing shadows bend at impossible angles in Gion, of hearing the chants from a temple that had been demolished decades ago, of the persistent feeling that the city map was lying. For the first time since the Murakami novel moved, I felt a profound, intoxicating wave of relief. I was not alone. We agreed to meet. The location was a small, quiet Kissaten in a sleepy alley near Imadegawa Street, a place of dark wood, soft jazz, and the rich aroma of siphon-brewed coffee. I arrived early, my journal clutched in my bag like a talisman. I scanned the faces of the few patrons, an old man reading a newspaper, two women chatting quietly. Then the door chimed and he walked in. He was younger than I expected, maybe a university student, with bright, intelligent eyes and a restless energy. He spotted me immediately, as if he knew exactly who he was looking for. "Aika-san?" he asked, a hopeful smile on his face. "I'm Kenji." Kitsune Mask. The relief was so intense it almost made me dizzy. We sat, And the words poured out of me. I told him about the bookshelf, the bakery sign, the mirrored kitchen. He didn't laugh. He nodded, his expression one of grim understanding. He pulled out his own phone and showed me his evidence, a photo of a statue's shadow falling in the wrong direction from the sun, a distorted audio recording of the streetcar bell, which, when played backwards, sounded unnervingly like a human whisper. "It's the grid," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The old Heian grid is reasserting itself. Or something is reasserting it for it. The city is being tuned. Recalibrated." He understood. He truly understood. I felt a bond forge between us in that moment, the desperate kinship of two sane people in a world gone quietly mad. We were the only ones who could see the seams of reality starting to fray. But as we talked, I began to notice something. A tick. A habit. The table setting was simple, a sugar bowl, a small pitcher of cream, and shakers for salt and pepper. As Kenji spoke, his hand kept darting out, almost unconsciously, to adjust them. He nudged the salt shaker a millimeter to the left. He rotated the sugar bowl so the small spoon was perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. He aligned them with the wood grain, with each other, with some invisible, perfect geometry only he could perceive. "The key is harmony," he said, his eyes flicking from my face to the condiments and back again. "The original city was a perfect mandala. A reflection of the heavens. But it's been corrupted. All this modern ugliness, it's created dissonance. The transience has to be corrected." My slowly dawning horror felt like ice water flooding my veins. I looked at his obsessive, precise movements, the way he straightened the pepper shaker for the 10th time. He wasn't fighting the anomaly. He wasn't an observer like me. He was a part of it. He was one of them. The affected. But somehow, he retained a sliver of self-awareness, a narrator for his own compulsion. He saw the changes because he was an agent of the change. His obsession with harmony and correction wasn't a theory, it was his function. He was an unconscious gardener, weeding and pruning reality according to a new, alien blueprint. The warmth of camaraderie vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged dread. I was not sitting with an ally. I was sitting with the contagion itself, wearing a human face. His eyes, which had been so bright and engaged, began to lose their focus, turning placid and distant. He looked at me, but it felt like he was looking at an object, assessing its position. "You're not aligned, Aika-san," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of its earlier urgency. The salt shaker was now a fraction of a millimeter out of place. His fingers twitched. "You're a point of friction in the pattern. You notice things because you resist the harmony." His gaze drifted to my handbag, to the way I was sitting, to the placement of my feet on the floor. "You need to be corrected." The placid suggestion was more terrifying than any threat of violence. It was the calm, rational offer of utter annihilation of the self. To be corrected was to be absorbed, to have my own will replaced by the silent, relentless logic of the grid. I was not an ally to him. I was a crooked picture frame on a wall, waiting to be straightened. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. I fled. There was no polite excuse, no graceful exit. I threw a few yen on the table for my coffee, mumbled something incoherent about being late, and pushed my chair back so violently it scraped across the wooden floor. Kenji didn't try to stop me. He just watched, his head tilted slightly, his expression one of mild, analytical curiosity, like a botanist observing a strange plant. His hand reached out and perfectly realigned the chair I had just disturbed. That small, corrective gesture was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. My flight through the streets of Kyoto was a waking nightmare. The city I had once loved for its predictable beauty now felt predatory. The confrontation wasn't with Kenji, but with the world he represented. The realization that there was no us versus them had shattered my last defense. The contagion wasn't an invading force, it was a conversion. It didn't break people, it retuned them. Every corner I turned felt like a gamble. Streets that my feet knew by heart seemed to subtly curve away from my intended path, guiding me into unfamiliar lanes. The faces of passers-by, once a tapestry of individual expressions, now seemed eerily blank, their movements possessing a strange, synchronized grace that I couldn't quite define but felt in my bones. Were they all like Kenji? Unwitting agents of this grand, silent rearrangement? Or was my own perception now so frayed that I was projecting the pattern onto everything I saw? When I finally stumbled through the door of my apartment, I slammed it shut and slid the bolt across, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the feeling of sanctuary was gone. My home was not a fortress, it was the nerve center of the attack. I stood in the center of the room, my eyes fixed on the bookshelf. The source. The conduit. And suddenly, with the horrifying clarity of a lightning strike, the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The Heian text. The geography of transference. My work. My meticulous, painstaking translation. I had treated it as a history, a description of a phenomenon. But the ancients didn't distinguish between description and invocation. To name a thing was to grant it power. To translate its concepts, to give its esoteric grammar a new form in a modern language, wasn't just an act of scholarship. It was an act of creation. An incantation. I was the one disturbing the grid. My mind, so perfectly suited for the precision of translation, my obsession with finding the exact right word, the perfect corresponding phrase, I was the ideal instrument. I wasn't just witnessing the reality shift, I was the one holding the chisel. Each translated sentence was another tapping away at the foundations of the world, activating the ancient lines of power that lay dormant beneath the city. The bookshelf wasn't a passive antenna, it was my workbench, and the text was my blueprint. Kenji wasn't an anomaly, he was the result. I walked towards the bookshelf, the heart of my world and the wellspring of its unraveling. The objects on its shelves were no longer still. I could perceive it now, a constant, infinitesimal hum of motion. A book's spine would lighten in color for a moment. The ceramic tanuki would drift a micron to the right. My dictionary lay open to a page I hadn't been reading, the definition of henkan, transformation, conversion, seeming to glow on the page. I stood before it, the choice laid bare. It was so simple, so absolute. I could destroy the text. I could take the manuscript, my notes, my laptop, and burn them. I could flee Kyoto, flee Japan, and hope to outrun the instability I had unleashed. Hope that without its translator, the incantation would fade. Or, I could lean into it. I could accept this new, fluid reality. I could stop fighting the current and learn to swim. The terror that had been my constant companion for weeks began to recede, replaced by a strange, profound calm. The world wasn't ending. It was just, changing its grammar. And I was the only one fluent in both languages. Underscore 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 underscore. Weeks, or perhaps months, have passed. It's hard to keep track of linear time when the environment it's measured against is no longer stable. I am still in my apartment. I am still translating. Something has changed within me. Or rather, something has been corrected. I no longer fight the shifts. I welcome them as one might welcome the changing of the seasons. There is a new harmony to my life, a fluid dance with the world. This morning, as I reached for my teacup, it slid gently across the kitchen counter to meet my hand. I simply took it, my muscles no longer flinching at the impossible. The movement felt natural, efficient. Correct. From my window, the view is wonderfully inconsistent. Sometimes I see the familiar gray wall of the neighboring building. Sometimes, for a few hours, I see the sloping roof of a temple that I know is 3 kilometers away. I watch it with a serene curiosity until it fades, replaced by a grove of bamboo I've never seen before. The world is a story that is constantly rewriting itself, and I am its privileged first reader. My journal now documents not aberrations, but moments of exquisite harmony. The rain today fell in a perfect iambic pentameter. The shadows of the power lines formed a flawless kanji for silence. I sit at my desk, my pen hovering over the final, cryptic passage of the Heian text. The English words flow from my mind, not with effort, but with the ease of instinct. I am no longer imposing one language upon another, I am revealing a truth that exists within both. My eyes drift to the bookshelf. The copy of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is on the move. I watch, without surprise, as it glides in a smooth, silent arc from the third shelf to the second, slotting itself perfectly into a space that opens up to receive it. A small smile touches my lips. It is not the smile of a victim, nor of a madwoman. It is a smile of understanding. Of belonging. My role is no longer a burden, but a purpose. I am not just a translator of words. I am a translator of reality itself. I haven't succumbed. I have adapted. I have found my place in the quiet, unfolding pattern of the world. The contagion has not claimed me. It has completed me. The city without a hum. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life is measured in decibels and hertz. As a field recordist, I don't just hear Toronto, I catalog it, dissect it, and bottle it for later use. I capture the city's sonic soul. The groan of the 501 streetcar on the Queen Street tracks, the percussive slap of a hockey puck against the boards in a community rink, the layered murmur of 100 languages in Kensington Market. I'm a librarian of ambient noise. My name is Leo Maxwell, and my ears are my livelihood. They pay the mortgage on my sterile Liberty Village condo, a place I chose specifically for its triple-paned windows and concrete construction. Silence, for me, is a canvas. It's the prerequisite for art. The first thread came loose on a Tuesday. I was on the pedestrian bridge over the Gardiner Expressway, a place I perversely love. It's a symphony of urban decay, the roar of engines, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the shudder of the metal walkway. And underneath it all, the constant, unwavering drone of the electrical grid. The 60-cycle hum. It's the city's foundational note, its OM. I had my Schoeps microphone nestled in its Zeppelin windshield, my headphones clamped tight. The recording seemed perfect. The cars were a beautiful, stereophonic sweep from left to right. The wind was a clean whisper. It was only back in my studio, hunched over the waveform on my monitor, that I noticed it. I soloed the track, cranking the gain until my speakers hissed. I listened. Nothing. I listened again. Where the low-frequency graph should have shown a solid bar at 60 Hz, there was just a flat, black line. The hum was gone. Not filtered, not masked. It was absent. My first thought was triumphant. This new preamp is a goddamn miracle. I made a mental note to email the manufacturer. Maybe atmospheric conditions have been perfect, a freak pocket of electromagnetic nullity right over the Gardiner. I shrugged, logged the recording as traffic_Gardiner_clean_01, and moved on. Coincidence. A week later, the second thread. I was capturing room tone in the Toronto Reference Library, a beautiful cathedral of knowledge and quiet focus. The goal wasn't silence, but the sound of silence, the gentle rustle of turning pages, the distant cough, the whisper-soft hum of the ventilation system. I set up in a corral on the 4th floor and let the tape roll for 20 minutes. In the studio, the result was wrong. It was too clean. The page turns were there, crisp and isolated. The cough was there, a lonely spike in the waveform. But the underlying bed of noise, the building's breath, was missing. The file was mostly dead air. It was like listening to a photograph of a library instead of being in one. I checked my gear again. I ran diagnostics. Everything was nominal. Stress, I told myself. My sister Chloe was always telling me I was wound too tight. You need a hobby that doesn't involve listening to things, Leo. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was developing some form of auditory pareidolia, finding patterns in the absence of noise. The disquiet began to seep into my daily life. My building, usually a predictable soundscape, was changing. Mrs. Henderson from 3B, a woman whose hearty morning, Leo, was as reliable as sunrise, stopped talking to me. I'd see her in the hall, her floral housecoat a familiar blur. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," I'd say. She would just nod, her lips pressed into a thin, apologetic line, and glide past. The strangest part was her feet. She always wore fluffy slippers that should have made a soft shuff-shuff on the runner. Now, she made no sound at all. She moved like a phantom. I started noticing it everywhere. On the subway, the automated announcer would declare, arriving at St. George Station, but her voice was tinny, isolated, without the usual bed of rail squeal and passenger chatter bleeding into the PA system. People still talked, but their conversations seemed to be happening in a vacuum. The sounds didn't blend or reverberate. They just occurred, then vanished. At my local coffee shop, the daily grind, the chaos was gone. The clatter of ceramic mugs, the roar of the grinder, the shouted names of customers, it had all been replaced by a tense, efficient quiet. The baristas, kids with piercings and art school tattoos who once yelled "Latte for Sarah," with theatrical flair, now just slid the cup onto the counter and pointed. Their movements were economical, designed to minimize noise. When the guy in front of me paid with a handful of change, he didn't drop it on the counter, he placed each coin down, one by one, as if he were disarming a bomb. The world was being muted, and I seemed to be the only one with the volume turned up high enough to notice the difference. I tried to talk to my boss, Mark. He runs the small post-production house where I freelance. I played him 2 tracks. The first, from last year, a recording of dogs and their owners at the Trinity Bellwoods Dog Bowl. It was a joyful cacophony, barks, yelps, laughter, frisbees slicing through the air. The second, from last weekend, the same location, same time of day. The dogs were there, chasing balls, but the sound was thin. Anemic. The barks were clipped, short bursts. The laughter was gone, replaced by smiles and silent gestures. Mark leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard. He listened with a professional's ear, his head tilted. "The new one's cleaner," he said, finally. "Less ambient crap. The signal-to-noise ratio is fantastic. Did you get a new mic?" "It's the same mic, Mark. Don't you hear it? The absence? It's not just clean, it's empty. The birds are gone. The background chatter is gone. The whole sound floor has dropped out." He looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Leo, you're the best ear I've got, but you sound like you're burning out." "It sounds fine. It sounds good. Less cleanup for you, right? What's the problem?" His dismissal was a cold weight in my stomach. The problem wasn't the sound. The problem was that he couldn't hear the silence. My own home became a laboratory. I started leaving recorders running in different rooms. I'd sit perfectly still on my sofa, headphones on, monitoring the live feed. I could hear the faint sigh of the refrigerator compressor, the drip of a faucet I needed to fix, the creak of the building settling. These were my anchors to reality. These sounds were still here. But then, one night, I captured something new. A rhythmic thump, 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 from the apartment above. It wasn't the sound of walking. It was too deliberate, too soft. It was the sound of someone pacing, but on the balls of their feet, carefully, trying not to make a sound. The effort was audible. The quiet was intentional. That night, I booked an appointment with an audiologist. There had to be a logical explanation, and it had to be me. A tumor on the auditory nerve. A rare form of tinnitus where one hears silence instead of ringing. I almost hoped for it. A diagnosis was a map. What I had now was a creeping fog, and I was losing my way. I sat in my silent condo, listening to the city hold its breath, and for the first time in my life, I was terrified of the quiet. It wasn't a canvas anymore. It was a void. And it was growing. The audiologist's office was in a glass tower on Bloor Street. Dr. Eris Thorne was a kind-looking woman with geometric glasses and a soothing, modulated voice. Her office was a sanctuary of controlled sound, walls covered in gray acoustic panels. "So, Mr. Maxwell," she began, looking at my intake form. "You're a sound engineer. And you're experiencing, what would you call it? Auditory changes? It's more like the world is changing, and I'm the only one who can hear it." The words sounded insane as soon as they left my mouth. I tried to explain. I talked about the 60-cycle hum, the room tone, the lack of sonic bleed. I described Mrs. Henderson's silent slippers and the muted coffee shop. Dr. Thorne listened patiently, nodding. "It's not uncommon for people with highly trained hearing to become hypersensitive," she said. "A kind of hyperacusis. Sometimes stress can manifest in fascinating ways, retuning how our brain processes familiar sounds." I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted this to be a problem inside my head. She put me in a soundproof booth. It was an anechoic chamber, a space so perfectly silent you could hear the blood pumping in your ears. I'd been in them before. They were usually deeply uncomfortable. This time, it felt normal. It felt like the outside world. That was the most terrifying part. The tests were exhaustive. Beeps and tones at frequencies only dogs and teenagers should hear. I heard them all. My chart, she later explained, was pristine. "Your hearing is exceptional, Mr. Maxwell," she said, her professional calm doing nothing to soothe me. "Textbook, in fact. You're in the top percentile for frequency differentiation and dynamic range. There is absolutely nothing physically wrong with your ears." I walked out of her office into the Bloor Street bustle. The sounds were all there, the traffic, the people, the distant wail of a siren, but they felt like a recording playing on cheap speakers. Each sound was sharp, distinct, and utterly separate from the others. There was no glue holding them together, no ambient hum to weave them into a single, cohesive reality. The city had lost its reverb. Dr. Thorne's verdict, that I was perfectly healthy, was the opposite of a relief. It slammed a door on the easy answers. The problem wasn't my ears. The problem was outside. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The rationalizations crumbled one by one, leaving me exposed. My meticulous equipment wasn't faulty. My hearing wasn't damaged. Stress wasn't a sufficient explanation for the creeping sonic void. The quiet, as I'd started calling it in my new journal, was real. My journal became my only confidant, a place to anchor my observations against the tide of self-doubt. October 12th, High Park. Took the parabolic mic, aimed it at a stand of maples, leaves turning brilliant red and orange. Expected the usual rustle, a sound like 1,000 tiny paper hands clapping. Got a dry, papery hiss instead. Thin. Brittle. Not a single birdsong in 20 minutes. Recorded a couple walking their dog. They communicated with hand signals. The dog, a golden retriever, didn't bark once. It was wearing soft booties on its paws. October 15th, St. Lawrence Market. The Saturday morning chaos is gone. The fishmongers who used to bellow about their daily catch now just point at their wares with gloved hands. The cheese vendors offer samples in complete silence. I watched a man drop a glass jar of olives. It hit the tile floor with a dull, unsatisfying thud, not a shatter. He and the vendor cleaned it up with a series of efficient, silent gestures, their faces impassive. I was becoming a ghost in my own city, a tourist in a place I once knew intimately. The change was subtle enough that anyone not actively listening for it would miss it entirely. People still functioned. The city still ran. But it was running on a new, silent operating system that I hadn't been issued. My isolation deepened. I called my sister, Chloe, a graphic designer who lives in Cabbagetown. Her life is a riot of color and loud opinions. Hey, Chloe. Weird question for you. No such thing from you, Leo, she said, her voice warm. I could hear her keyboard clacking in the background. A good, solid, normal sound. Have you noticed, things seem quieter lately? A pause. The clacking stopped. Quieter. Leo, I live 2 blocks from a fire station and my neighbor is learning the bagpipes. No, things are not quieter. You sound stressed. Are you sleeping? I'm sleeping. It's just, the quality of the sound is different. It's like the background noise has been scooped out. Scooped out? What does that even mean? You need to take a break. Go up to Muskoka for a weekend. Stare at a lake. Don't listen to it, just look at it. Her concern felt like pity. She heard my words, but not the terror behind them. My best friend, Ben, was my last hope. He's a sound mixer for a downtown theater, another man who speaks the language of audio. I invited him over, my hands trembling slightly as I queued up the recordings. Okay, listen to this, I said, my voice too loud in the quiet of my condo. Trinity Bellwoods. August 2023. I played the old recording. The room filled with the vibrant, messy sounds of life. Ben nodded, sipping his beer. Nice texture. Good depth. Now listen to this. Same place, last week. I played the new recording. The thin, sterile sounds trickled from the speakers. The silence between the clipped barks was immense. Ben frowned, leaning forward. He listened intently, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. He was hearing it. He had to be. He said, stroking his chin. The new one's cleaner, I guess. The EQ is a little flat, maybe. You could boost the mids. But the separation is incredible. What did you do, use a different polar pattern? My hope curdled into dread. Ben, forget the tech specs. Listen to what's not there. The life. The energy. It's gone. He looked at me, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to friendly concern. The same look Chloe gave me. Leo, man, it's a recording. It sounds fine. A little sterile, maybe, but that's fixable in post. You're obsessing. It's just audio. Just audio. To him, it was a technical problem. To me, it was the sound of reality fraying at the edges. I felt a chasm open between us. He lived in a world of normal, predictable sound. I lived in this new, muted version, and the difference was screamingly loud to me and utterly inaudible to him. After he left, I felt more alone than ever. My paranoia took root. I started carrying a small, powerful digital recorder everywhere, the microphone hidden in my sleeve. I became a spy, an archivist of the dying world. I'd sit on park benches, trying to capture the eerie new quiet. I'd point the mic at people having conversations, noting the clipped cadence of their speech, the lack of hesitation markers like, or ah. Their communication was becoming more efficient. More, digital. This new hobby earned me hostile stares. A woman on the streetcar saw the wire running to my cuff and accused me of being a pervert. She didn't shout. She hissed the word, a sharp, sibilant burst of sound that made the other passengers turn their heads, not in alarm, but with a strange, collective curiosity, like owls tracking a mouse. I got off at the next stop, my heart hammering. Desperate for a tangible clue, I started digging online. I searched for, mass acoustic phenomenon, auditory dampening Toronto, citywide silence. The results were useless, noise complaints, articles about the health benefits of quiet, tinnitus forums filled with people tormented by sounds I would now give anything to hear. It was like shouting into a void. I was the only one. Then I found a different kind of pattern. It was a red herring, I thought at first, a distraction. But it was something concrete, something I could investigate. I noticed that the Echo, a sound-based art installation in a small parquet near OCAD University, was fenced off. It was a series of polished steel horns that were supposed to capture street sounds and replay them in a distorted, melodic loop. A sign on the fence read, "Closed for unscheduled maintenance." A week later, I was walking through the distillery district. The famous kinetic sculpture, a towering metal tree with hundreds of small chimes that sang in the wind, was still. The chimes were tied down with thin, black wires. Another small sign, temporarily decommissioned. A pattern. Anything designed to create or manipulate ambient sound was being neutralized. This felt like a real lead. It felt sane. A municipal conspiracy was infinitely more palatable than a reality-bending contagion. I started a new section in my journal, The Silencers. I spent days scouring the City of Toronto's Public Works website, digging through budgets and committee meeting minutes. It was boring, methodical work, and it was a relief. It felt like my old job. I found it buried in an appendix of a 2019 Arts and Culture budget proposal. A line item for the phased decommissioning of non-essential sonic installations. The official reason was budget cuts and maintenance costs. It was a plausible, mundane explanation. But the dates didn't quite line up with when I'd noticed the changes. It was close, but not perfect. Still, I clung to it. This was my subplot, my manageable mystery. It was a trail I could follow. I started mapping the decommissioned art pieces. The Echo. The distillery chimes. A listening station at the North York Central Library, now permanently roped off. A water feature in David Picot Square that used to have a complex, bubbling rhythm, now just a silent, still pool. Someone was actively curating the city's soundscape, pruning it, quieting it. And they were using the city bureaucracy as cover. Why? Was it related to the wider quiet? Or was I just connecting unrelated dots, my mind desperate to form a narrative out of the encroaching silence? One evening, I was tracking the source of a low-frequency broadcast I'd picked up near the CN Tower. It wasn't a hum, but a pulse, almost subliminal. My gear led me to an alleyway behind a nondescript office building. A ventilation grate, humming not with air, but with this rhythmic, low-end wave. I knelt, aiming my microphone, trying to get a clean recording. A footstep behind me. I turned. A man in a simple gray uniform, like a city maintenance worker, was standing there. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my microphone. His face was blank, utterly devoid of expression. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand and pointed, first at my microphone, and then down the alley, in the direction I had come from. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. A silent, unarguable imperative. I scrambled to my feet, gathering my gear. I didn't run. Running would be noisy. I walked away, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the pavement. I didn't look back, but I could feel his silent, placid gaze on me until I turned the corner. The quiet was no longer just an absence. It had agents. It had enforcers. And I had just appeared on their radar. The manageable subplot of decommissioned art had just merged with the terrifying main feature. The mystery was no longer about art or budgets. It was about control. The silence was being imposed. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The encounter with the silent man in the gray uniform shattered my last illusion of safety. The quiet wasn't a passive environmental change, it was an active, enforced reality. My investigation into the decommissioned art installations was no longer a quirky side project. It was the key. I dug deeper, not into current city records, but into archives. I spent days at the reference library, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers and defunct city planning documents. I was looking for a ghost. The name of the game was keywords: acoustic, sonic, urban resonance, noise abatement. I found it in a box of uncatalogued proposals from the early 1970s. A slim, spiral-bound report with a faded, optimistic cover. The title was Project Serenity. It was an esoteric, almost mystical urban renewal plan. The language was a bizarre mix of engineering jargon and New Age philosophy. It spoke of sonic dissonance as a source of social anxiety and urban decay. It theorized that a city's ambient frequency could be retuned to promote harmony and productivity. The proposal detailed a plan to embed experimental acoustic dampening materials into new construction, and, more disturbingly, to deploy a network of low-frequency resonance emitters disguised as public infrastructure, transformers, cell towers, ventilation grates. The project was officially ridiculed and abandoned in 1974. A newspaper clipping I found called it pseudoscience peddled by charlatans. It was a dead end, a historical curiosity. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had resurrected it? Not with 1970s technology, but with modern precision. What if they had finally made it work, and it was working far better than its creators had ever dreamed? It explained everything: the missing hum, the targeted silencing of sonic art, the low-frequency pulses I was detecting. Someone was trying to retune Toronto. This theory, as terrifying as it was, felt solid. It was technological. It was man-made. It could, therefore, be understood. It could be fought. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to see the flaws in my own logic. This wasn't just about technology. The quiet was changing people. I saw it on the street every day. A new, silent grammar was emerging. A nod replaced a "thank you." A subtle hand gesture replaced "excuse me." People moved through crowds with a fluid, silent grace, anticipating each other's movements to avoid collision or the sound of an apology. It was a hive mind learning to operate without the inefficiency of speech. The most chilling observation came from watching children. I was in a playground near my condo. A little girl, no older than 5, tripped and scraped her knee badly. She sat up, looked at the bright red blood welling up, and her face crumpled. Her mouth opened, ready for the universal wail of childhood pain. But then she looked around. She saw her mother, and the other parents, all watching her with the same blank, placid stillness. The girl's mouth closed. A single tear tracked a path through the dirt on her cheek. She got up, wiped the blood on her shorts, and hobbled silently back to the swings. The instinct to make noise, to cry in pain, to shout for joy, was being unlearned. Suppressed. This wasn't just acoustic dampening. This was psychological conditioning on a massive scale. The quiet escalated from passive to active. It began to correct me. One night, I was cooking dinner. Lost in thought, I dropped a heavy cast-iron skillet on my tiled kitchen floor. The sound was obscene. A violent, explosive clang that ripped through the fabric of the night. It felt like a gunshot in a cathedral. I froze, my body rigid. For a few seconds, there was only the ringing in my own ears. Then, a new sound. Or rather, a new lack of it. The faint, ever-present whisper of the ventilation in my condo, a sound I had clung to as proof of normalcy, stopped. The entire building went dead silent. Then came the tapping. Tap. 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 It wasn't a knock. It was a soft, rhythmic, insistent pressure on my front door. It was the sound of a fingernail on wood, amplified by the profound silence. My blood ran cold. I crept to the peephole, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. In the distorted fisheye lens, I saw Mrs. Henderson from 3B. She wasn't alone. 2 other residents from my floor, a young man I recognized from the gym and a woman I'd seen in the laundry room, stood beside her. Their faces were as smooth and emotionless as stones. Their eyes were fixed on my door. They weren't angry or threatening. They were corrective. They were like antibodies drawn to an infection. The infection was my noise. Tap. 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 The sound was maddeningly gentle. I backed away from the door, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare make another sound. I retreated to my bedroom, the farthest point from the door, and sat on the floor, holding my breath. They stood there for an hour. The tapping never changed in its rhythm or intensity. It was patient. Inescapable. Then, as silently as they had arrived, they were gone. I waited another hour before daring to look again. The hallway was empty. The ventilation sighed back to life. I didn't sleep. The incident clarified the nature of the threat in a way no research could. This wasn't a top-down conspiracy I could expose. The contagion was spreading through the people themselves. They were the system. They were the enforcers. The tapping wasn't a threat of violence. It was an invitation. A summons to join the quiet. I had to find an ally. Someone from the old world. My search for Project Serenity had turned up one name that wasn't on the official planning committee but was cited in the footnotes as a consultant, Arthur Vance. A former urban theorist and sociologist. After a week of frantic searching, I found him. He was alive, living in a secluded, modern-looking house in the Bridle Path, one of Toronto's wealthiest, quietest neighborhoods. Hope, desperate and irrational, surged in me. He had been there at the genesis of this thing. He would understand. He had to. I drove to his house, my small car incongruous among the Bentleys and Teslas. The house was a fortress of glass and stark white concrete, surrounded by a meticulously manicured lawn. There was no doorbell. Just a smooth, featureless panel. I knocked. The sound of my knuckles on the thick wood was loud and vulgar. The door opened silently. A man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and piercingly intelligent blue eyes, stood before me. He was tall and wore a simple, soft-looking cashmere sweater. "Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You must be Leo Maxwell," he said. His voice was a low, perfectly controlled whisper. "I've been expecting you. Please, come in." He led me into a cavernous living room. The floors were covered in thick, plush carpets. The walls were lined not with bookshelves, but with what looked like acoustic foam arranged in artistic patterns. The air was perfectly still and silent. "You've been expecting me?" I asked, bewildered. "I monitor certain frequencies. Inquiries into old projects. Your digital footsteps are quite loud, Mr. Maxwell," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. He gestured for me to sit on a soft, deep sofa. "You've noticed the change. The great smoothing." "The what?" "The quiet, as you call it in your journal." My blood froze. He knew about my journal. He saw the fear on my face. "Don't be alarmed. Your dedication is admirable. You hear it more clearly than anyone." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial murmur. Project Serenity was just a clumsy prototype. A child's drawing of a cathedral. We were trying to use crude tools to achieve what the world was already beginning to do on its own. We were trying to impose order on chaos. He listened as I poured out my story, the recordings, the isolation, the tapping on my door. He nodded grimly, his expression one of profound understanding. He seemed to be the same man I had been searching for, a fellow resistor living in a soundproofed bunker. "You are not insane, Leo," he said, and I almost wept with relief. "You are simply awake during a time of profound transition. You need a safe place. A sanctuary where you can adjust." He offered me that sanctuary. A room in his silent house. A place to work, to think, to be safe from the tapping fingers and the placid, corrective stares. But as I sat there, in the perfect, oppressive silence of his home, I started to notice things. The e-reader on his coffee table, no rustling paper. The glass of water he drank, no clinking ice. The food he offered me was soft, a pureed soup and bread with no crust. The grand clock on the wall had no ticking hands, its face was a digital display that shifted numbers without a sound. Arthur Vance wasn't a resistor. He was the high priest. He wasn't hiding from the quiet. He was cultivating it. This wasn't a bunker. It was a temple. And his offer of sanctuary wasn't an act of kindness. It was an offer of conversion. The great smoothing he spoke of wasn't a tragedy. To him, it was salvation. And I had just delivered myself to his door. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The realization dawned not as a sudden shock, but as a cold, creeping certainty. Arthur Vance's home wasn't a sanctuary, it was a conversion chamber. He saw the terror in my eyes and interpreted it as the confusion of a novice on the brink of enlightenment. Sound is chaos, Leo, he explained, his whispery voice filling the dead air of the room. He walked over to a large, dark screen on the wall and touched its surface. A map of Toronto bloomed into view, overlaid with a complex, shifting web of light. It's friction. Inefficiency. It's the noise of decay, of biology fighting itself. Every word spoken is a waste of energy. Every unnecessary footstep, a tiny, pointless earthquake. He zoomed in on a section of the downtown core. Red pinpricks of light flared up and then quickly faded. Sonic disturbances, he said, his tone that of a doctor pointing out cancer cells. A car backfiring. A dog barking. A person shouting in anger. He touched one of the fading red dots. And here, a pan being dropped in a kitchen in Liberty Village. He looked at me. My kitchen. My pan. We aren't imposing this, Leo. We are merely facilitating it. Guiding it. The world wants to be quiet. People want harmony. The tapping on your door wasn't a threat. It was an offer of help. An invitation to join the consensus reality. He showed me live audio feeds, or rather, the lack of them. He could pinpoint any sonic pollutant in the city. His regulators, the quiet people in gray uniforms like the one I'd met, weren't a secret police force. They were just ordinary citizens, early adopters, who would be silently alerted to a disturbance and feel a communal pull to go and correct it. To stand, to watch, to tap, to apply the gentle, overwhelming pressure of the collective until the noise stopped. The goal wasn't punishment. It was absorption. Assimilation into the silence. You cannot fight it, Arthur said, his voice laced with something like pity. It's like trying to fight gravity. Why would you want to? Stay here. Learn the new language. Find peace in the efficiency. My fight-or-flight instinct, a primal, noisy thing, screamed at me. I had to get out. But how do you escape a trap where the very act of escape, making noise, is the trigger? The house was a maze of sound-dampening foam and soft surfaces, a predator designed to swallow sound. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon. Not a weapon to harm him, but a weapon of noise. I saw it in a corner, covered by a soft velvet cloth. A relic from another age. What is that? I asked, my voice hoarse. Arthur followed my gaze. A curiosity. From the old world. A turntable. Obsolete technology. All that crackling and popping, so much static. Static. Chaos. My only way out. I feigned a moment of consideration. Maybe you're right, Arthur. I'm just overwhelmed. Can I have a moment? To think? He smiled, a serene, knowing expression. Of course, Leo. Take all the time you need. The silence is very patient. He turned back to his map, a god tending to his silent creation. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the corner. Every step was a gamble. I lifted the velvet cloth. An old, beautiful Thorin's turntable. Beside it, a shelf of vinyl records. My hand trembled as I picked one. John Coltrane. A Love Supreme. With a surge of adrenaline, I flipped the switches. I put the record on the platter, lowered the needle. For a second, there was only the soft hiss and crackle of the vinyl. Then, the first notes of Coltrane's saxophone erupted into the room. It was more than just sound. It was a raw, passionate, chaotic scream of life. It was everything the quiet was not. The effect on Arthur was instantaneous and profound. He cried out, a strangled, unused sound, and staggered back from the monitor, his hands flying to his ears. His face, once a mask of placid control, contorted in agony. The music wasn't just loud. It was a pollutant, a poison that violated the sterile perfection of his world. The sound of the saxophone was my cover. I ran. I bolted for the front door, my boots thudding on the plush carpet, a glorious, defiant rhythm. I threw the door open and sprinted out into the manicured perfection of the bridle path. The suburban night was no escape. The streetlights flickered in the same silent, rhythmic patterns I had seen downtown. A man walking his dog on the other side of the street stopped, his head tilting not towards me, but towards the sound pouring from Arthur's open door. The dog, a sleek Doberman, didn't bark, it just sat, its body rigid. People were emerging from their fortress-like homes, not running, but drifting onto their lawns, their faces blank, all turned towards the source of the sonic infection. I didn't stop running. I found my car, the sound of the engine turning over a roaring declaration of war. I sped away, leaving the silent, converging crowd behind. Driving through the city was a nightmare journey through a new dimension. The world looked the same, but it was a pantomime. The life had been hollowed out. On my phone, I saw the fragmented reports, no longer looking like glitches. Widespread cell network silence in London. Broadcast dead zones baffling Tokyo engineers. Unexplained acoustic lull over Chicago. Project Serenity wasn't the cause. It was just a symptom, a primitive human attempt to name and control a phenomenon that was already beginning, a fundamental shift in the physics of reality. The world was shedding its noise like a snake sheds its skin. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 weeks later. The city is a memory. I am in Algonquin Park, a 5-hour drive north of the silent metropolis. I live in a small, dilapidated cabin I found abandoned by a lake. Here, there are other sounds. The wind in the pines. The cry of a loon across the water. The crackle of my campfire. These sounds are my acts of defiance. My prayer. I have become what I once studied, a source of ambient noise. I spend my days with my recorder, creating an archive of a forgotten world. The sound of me chopping wood. The sound of me boiling water. The sound of my own ragged breathing in the cold morning air. This is my journal now, a record of existence measured in the decibels of being alive. I don't know if I'm the last one. I don't know if there are others like me, holed up in the noisy places of the world, guarding their own little pockets of chaos. Or maybe I'm just uniquely sensitive, a man out of tune with the universe's new key. Sometimes, at dusk, I see them. Figures standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the ring of my firelight. They are indistinct, silent silhouettes against the dying light. They don't approach. They don't threaten. They just watch, their stillness a profound statement. They are patient. They know that eventually, my wood will run out. My food will be gone. My breath will cease to be drawn. Silence is the natural state of the cosmos, the inevitable victor. Tonight, I record the wind. I hold the microphone up to the darkness and listen. But it no longer sounds like wind. The sibilant rush through the trees, the whisper over the surface of the lake, it has a new quality. It sounds smoother now. More rhythmic. It sounds like the slow, quiet exhalation of a single, vast, sleeping lung. The world is holding its breath. And I am the last, fading noise before it is finally, completely, still. The wrong shade of sky. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first lie arrived on a Tuesday. It came through the feedback portal of Aura Weather, my app, my baby. I was sitting in my cramped home office in New Farm, Brisbane, the winter sun slanting through the blinds, painting warm stripes across my desk. The air outside was a crisp, perfect 17 degrees Celsius. The sky, I could see by leaning 2 inches to my left, was a magnificent, aching blue. Not a cloud in sight. Textbook. User_7B4F2, reporting wrong sky color. It's green. I snorted, sipping my lukewarm coffee. Trolls. The internet's eternal background radiation. My app was a data aggregator, a sleek interface for the raw, beautiful numbers fed from the Bureau of Meteorology. From global satellites, from a dozen different APIs I'd painstakingly stitched together. It measured air pressure, humidity, wind speed, UV index, and particulate matter. It did not, however, have a sensor for sky color. That was interpretive. I tapped out a polite, pre-written response about checking display settings and flicked the report into the spam folder. My name is Leo Sterling. I'm 32, and my world is made of data. Data is clean. It is pure. It doesn't lie or have opinions. People, on the other hand, are a mess of subjectivity and faulty wiring. I'd learned early on to trust the numbers over the noise. It's why Aura Weather was successful, in its modest way. It had over 50,000 downloads, a solid 4.8-star rating, and a small but loyal base of premium subscribers who, like me, appreciated the comfort of empirical truth. It told you not what the weather felt like, but what it was. The second lie came an hour later. User_C1E09, app shows sunny but the sky is totally wrong. Slate gray here in West End. I paused, mouse hovering over the delete button. 2 in an hour was unusual. I ran a diagnostic on the user location data. Both reports were geolocated to Brisbane, about 5 kilometers apart. Coincidence? I flagged it as spam and went back to debugging a memory leak in the Android build. The hum of my server rack in the corner was a familiar comfort, the city's traffic a distant, rhythmic shush. It was a normal day. That evening, I met Chloe for drinks at a bar overlooking the Story Bridge. The bridge was lit up in garish purple, its reflection shivering on the dark water of the river. Chloe was my only full-time employee, a whip-smart UI/UX designer who translated my raw data streams into something beautiful and intuitive. She was also my closest thing to a best friend. 2 in one day, she said, swirling the ice in her gin and tonic. Probably some kids from UQ messing with you. Remember that time they tried to convince everyone the ibis was a protected species? They are a protected species, I said automatically, a useless fact I'd absorbed somewhere. She waved a dismissive hand. You know what I mean. A coordinated prank. Ignore it. How's the predictive wind shear algorithm coming along? We talked about code. We talked about her disastrous Tinder date from the weekend and my ongoing battle with the body corporate over my server's electricity consumption. I looked up at the sky, past the city glow. It was a deep, star-pricked indigo, exactly as it should be on a clear winter's night. I felt the brief knot of unease in my gut loosen. Chloe was right. It was nothing. But the next day, there were 5 more reports. User_A9A21, Paddington, sickly green sky today. Please fix. User_D55F0, Tuwong, sky looks like dull metal. Not blue. User underscore 7B4F2, again, still green. I pulled up the satellite imagery on my main monitor. A vast, high-resolution canvas showed southeastern Queensland basking under a flawless azure dome. I cross-referenced with the bomb's Himawari 8 feed. Same story. Perfect blue. I checked the ground-based skycams at Archerfield and Brisbane Airport. Blue, blue, blue. The data was unequivocal. My app didn't have a function to report the sky's color, but it had a general feedback form. Why were they choosing this? This specific, baseless complaint? I felt a prickle of irritation. It was like someone walking into a library and complaining the books were all in the wrong language. I started my commute to the small co-working space we rented in Fortitude Valley. Walking down Brunswick Street, I made a conscious effort to look up. The sky was a vibrant, crystalline blue. The winter air was so clear you could almost see the individual Moreton Bay figs on the distant slopes of Mount Coot-tha. Everything was normal. Then I saw it. I was waiting at a pedestrian crossing, looking at my own reflection in the tinted window of a sleek black SUV. My face was there, pale and anxious, but behind my reflection, in the mirrored glass, the sky was a strange, bruised green. A color like old copper. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was viscerally, fundamentally wrong. I whipped my head around to look up at the actual sky. Blue. A perfect, placid, incontrovertible blue. I stared back at the car window. My reflection stared back, and behind it, the sky was blue again. My breath hitched. It must have been the tint on the glass. Some weird polarization effect. It had to be. I felt a wave of dizziness, a disconnect between what my eyes had just seen and what they were seeing now. The crossing light turned green, and the crowd surged forward, pulling me with them. For the rest of the walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had caught reality in a lie. That afternoon, I wrote a simple script to filter any feedback containing the words sky, color, green, gray, or slate. They would be automatically quarantined, out of sight and out of mind. It was a digital solution to a human problem. Trolls and weirdos. That's all it was. I was letting it get to me. Stress. I hadn't been sleeping well. My own mind was playing tricks on me, primed by the nonsense reports. That was the most logical explanation. Data, I reminded myself. Trust the data. The data said the sky was blue. Over the next 2 weeks, the quarantine folder grew. From a dozen a day to 50. Then 100. It was a silent, creeping tide of wrongness that only I could see. I checked the folder obsessively, a ritual of morbid fascination. The reports were all from Brisbane and its surrounding suburbs. Ipswich, Logan, Redcliffe. A slowly expanding circle of cognitive dissonance. I tried to talk to Chloe about it again, trying to keep my voice casual. Hey, you know those weird sky reports? I'm getting over 100 a day now. She was sketching out a new layout for the precipitation map. She didn't look up. Wow. Persistent little buggers, aren't they? Just block them. Or maybe we should add a feature. Troll of the day. But it's the specificity of it, I pushed. They're all saying the same thing. Green. Or slate. She finally looked up, a hint of concern in her eyes. Leo, are you okay? You seem a bit fixated on this. It's just spam. Don't let it get in your head. Her gaze was clear, her concern genuine. And in that moment, I felt a chasm open between us. She couldn't see the pattern. She couldn't see the sheer, statistical improbability of hundreds of random people making the same bizarre, inaccurate observation. To her, it was noise. To me, it was becoming a signal. The isolation began then. Not a physical isolation, I was still surrounded by the 8 million souls of a thriving city, but a deeper, more profound severance. I was standing on the shore of reality, watching a tide of madness creep in that only I could perceive. My own life became a frantic exercise in cross-referencing. I'd walk outside and my first instinct wouldn't be to feel the sun on my skin but to catalog the precise shade of the sky, comparing it to the Pantone color charts I'd bookmarked on my phone. Azure, 17 to 4027. Cerulean, 15 to 4323. It was always a perfect match. And yet, the doubts gnawed at me. Was I checking because I knew I was right, or because I was terrified I might be wrong? One Saturday, I was at a local farmer's market in New Farm Park. The place was teeming with life, young families, dogs, the smell of coffee and frying halloumi. I was buying sourdough when I overheard a conversation between the baker and a woman ahead of me. "Lovely day for it, eh?" the baker said, bagging a loaf. "Oh, beautiful," the woman replied, squinting at the sky. "Though I do wish the sun would break through this gray. It's been slate-colored like this for weeks." The baker nodded sagely. "Tell me about it. Hardly feels like winter." I froze, my hand hovering over the olives. I looked up. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless, piercing blue. The sun was a dazzling orb, casting sharp, distinct shadows on the grass. There was no gray. There was no slate. There was nothing to break through. I must have been staring, my mouth slightly agape, because the baker looked at me. "You right there, mate?" "The sky," I stammered, pointing upwards with a trembling finger. It's blue." He followed my gaze, then looked back at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and pity. It was the look you give a drunk man arguing with a parking meter. "Right," he said slowly, his eyes flicking to the woman, who gave a slight, uncomfortable shrug. "Well. It's a bit of a funny blue then, isn't it? Almost gray." "It's not," I insisted, my voice rising. "It's objectively blue. Look." The woman took her bread and hurried away. The baker's face hardened. "$6.50 for the sourdough, mate. Or are you just here to comment on the weather?" I paid for the bread, my hands shaking. I walked away, feeling the weight of their stares on my back. It wasn't just online anymore. It was here. It was real. A shared delusion, spoken of as casually as the price of bread. I stumbled over to a park bench, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the faces of the people around me, laughing, talking, eating. Were they all seeing it? This false sky? Or were they just agreeing? A quiet, polite madness had taken root, and I was the only one screaming that the emperor had no clouds. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a fact. I was on an island, and the sea level was rising. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The quarantine folder became my oracle. I stopped trying to delete or ignore the reports. Instead, I started mapping them. Every night, after Chloe had left the co-working space and the city had settled into its evening hum, I'd export the geolocations and plot them on a digital map of Brisbane. At first, it was a rash of red dots clustered around the inner city suburbs, West End, Paddington, New Farm. But night after night, the rash spread. It crept north across the river to Chermside, south to Mount Gravatt, west along the train line to Indooroopilly. It moved like a mold, a silent, cognitive bloom. I tried to find a pattern. Was it demographic? Age? Proximity to mobile phone towers? Power lines? Nothing. The contagion, if that's what it was agnostic. It infected old and young, rich and poor. The only commonality was the specific, shared delusion: the sky was not blue. My attempts to breach the wall of consensus became more desperate, and more alienating. I cornered Chloe by the coffee machine, my laptop open to the spreading map of red dots. "Look," I said, my voice tight. "This isn't random. This is a pattern. It's growing by about 300 meters a day, concentrically, from an origin point somewhere near Tu Wong Cemetery. Chloe stared at the map, then at me. There was no flicker of understanding, only a deep, weary concern. Leo, these are just user reports. It could be a botnet. It could be a feedback loop in the app. It could be anything. She reached out and touched my arm. Her skin was warm. You've been working too hard. You're not sleeping. Chloe, listen to me, I pleaded, turning the laptop to face her fully. Yesterday, at the market, I heard people talking about it. A slate-colored sky. I pointed out that it was blue, and they looked at me like I was insane. She sighed, the sound full of a patience I was beginning to dread. She glanced out the large office window. The afternoon sky was a soft, hazy blue, the kind that promised a cool evening. Okay, she said, her voice gentle, the way you'd speak to a frightened child. But, Leo, look. It is a bit slaty today, isn't it? A bit muted. My blood ran cold. I followed her gaze. The sky was blue. It was a pale, winter blue, but it was undeniably, fundamentally blue. There was no slate. No gray. No green. Just blue. No, I whispered, staring at her. No, it's not. She gave me a small, sad smile. Maybe we just see colors differently. She squeezed my arm again and walked back to her desk, leaving me standing by the window, the chasm between us now a vast, uncrossable canyon. She was one of them. Or, more terrifyingly, perhaps I was the one who was wrong. That was the moment the real fear began. Not the fear of an external phenomenon, but the fear of my own mind. The terror of cognitive isolation. I was a single data point diverging from the trend line. An anomaly. And anomalies get corrected. I started a journal. Not a digital one, I couldn't trust my own machines anymore, but a cheap spiral-bound notebook from the newsagent. I wrote in it with a black ballpoint pen, my handwriting growing smaller and more frantic as the days passed. June 14th. The circle now covers most of the inner city. 487 reports today. Phrase prevalence, slate, 42%, greenish, 31%, dull, 19%, other/vague, 8%. I checked my own vision again. Online color blindness tests. All normal. I can differentiate between hashtag ADD8E6, light blue, and hashtag D8D8D8, light gray, with 100% accuracy. The problem is not my eyes. June 17th. It happened again. In the mirror this time. Brushing my teeth. In the reflection, the slice of sky visible through the bathroom window was the color of jade. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds. I timed it. When I looked directly, it was blue. I felt nauseous for an hour afterwards. Am I catching it? Is it a virus of perception? Can you fight it by consciously reasserting reality? I spent 10 minutes staring at the sky, repeating "the sky is blue" like a mantra. I felt like a lunatic. June 21st. The winter solstice. I tried to talk to my mother on the phone. She's in Melbourne. I asked her what the sky looked like. She said it was overcast. I pressed her. But underneath the clouds, what color would it be? She got flustered. What a strange question, Leo. Blue, I suppose. It's always blue, isn't it? She sounded so certain. Is it just Brisbane? Is this ground zero? My research became an obsession. I dove into the darkest corners of the internet, my search history a testament to a mind unraveling, mass psychogenic illness, shared hallucinations, folie à plusieurs, environmental cognitive triggers, meme hazards. I found forums filled with people who believed in far stranger things, but none of them mentioned this. My specific madness seemed to be my own. And then I found the subplot. A threadbare, forgotten corner of my own city's history. It started with a search for atmospheric experiments in Queensland. I was thinking toxins, chemical sprays, the usual paranoid fare. But I stumbled upon a digitized article from a 1978 edition of the University of Queensland student newspaper. The headline was grainy, Project Blue Sky or Pie in the Sky. Whitaker's Weather Wand. The article was brief and vaguely mocking. It described a project led by a Dr. Alastair Whitaker from the physics department, an eccentric academic who believed he could influence local weather patterns using extremely low-frequency (ELF) radio waves. He claimed that by broadcasting a specific resonant frequency into the ionosphere, he could encourage the aggregation of water molecules, effectively nudging clouds into existence. The article called it fringe science and mentioned the project was quietly defunded after failing to produce any verifiable results. It was a dead end. A quaint piece of local academic history. But the name, Project Blue Sky, stuck in my craw. It was too perfect, too ironic. It felt like a clue planted by a universe with a sick sense of humor. I filed it away in my notebook, a single, tantalizing thread in a web of confusion. A red herring, most likely, but it was something to hold on to. The isolation deepened. I started avoiding conversations about the weather, which in a city like Brisbane is like trying to avoid conversations about air. It's the conversational bedrock, the social lubricant. My evasiveness made me seem strange, aloof. At the co-working space, people stopped inviting me for coffee. Chloe treated me with a delicate, professional kindness that felt worse than open hostility. She thought I was having a breakdown, and perhaps I was. How could I prove I wasn't? My only evidence was the very thing everyone else denied. One evening, leaving the office, I saw a woman standing on the footpath, phone to her ear, looking up at the sky. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting pools of orange on the pavement. The sky above was a deep, flawless twilight purple. "No, it's still that awful green color," she said into her phone. "Hasn't been a properly blue day in months." "Yeah. It's draining, isn't it?" I just stood there, watching her. She wasn't angry or distressed. She said it with a kind of resigned normality, the way one might complain about traffic. This wasn't a delusion. A delusion is a false belief held in the face of contradictory evidence. But what happens when the evidence itself is no longer shared? What if reality isn't a fixed point, but a consensus? A vote. And I was losing, badly. The most terrifying part was the creeping self-doubt. The brief flickers of green and gray I was experiencing were becoming more frequent. A flash of a slate-colored sky in the reflection of a puddle. A momentary, sickly viridian hue in my peripheral vision as I drove over the Captain Cook Bridge. Each time, a jolt of pure terror went through me, the feeling of my own senses betraying me. Each time, I'd snap my focus back and the world would correct itself, the blue rushing back in like a held breath. But it was getting harder. It took more effort. It felt like I was holding a door shut against an immense, silent pressure. I began to fear sleep. I was terrified I'd wake up one morning and the door would have been forced open, that I would look out my window and see a green sky, and the worst part, the absolute horror of it, was the fear that I wouldn't find it strange at all. That I would just accept it. That the man who wrote in his frantic notebook, the man who clung to the memory of blue, would be gone forever. I had to find out what Project Blue Sky really was. It was my only lead, my only hope of finding an anchor in the swirling chaos of my own perception. I felt like a sailor on a featureless ocean, and the name Alastair Whitaker was the only star in a wrong-colored sky. I had to find him. If he even still existed. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Finding Dr. Alastair Whitaker was like searching for a ghost in a library of ghosts. He wasn't on social media. He had no recent academic publications. The University of Queensland listed him as retired since 1995. There were no forwarding addresses, no digital footprints. He had successfully faded into the analog past. My breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the white pages. An A. Whitaker was listed in a suburb of the Gap, a leafy enclave nestled against the foothills of Mount Kutha. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I drove there on a Saturday morning. The sky above was a brilliant, defiant blue. I repeated it to myself as I drove, a litany against the encroaching strangeness. The sky is blue. The sky is blue. The house was a classic Queenslander, high-set on stilts, shrouded by overgrown poinciana trees and tangled bougainvillea. It looked tired, the paint peeling, the garden reclaiming its territory. I walked up the creaking wooden stairs and knocked. The man who answered was old, probably in his late 80s, with a cloud of thin white hair and eyes that were still sharp and intelligent behind thick glasses. They darted over me, taking in my nervous energy, my sweaty palms. "Mr. Whitaker?" I asked, my voice thin. "Dr. Alastair Whitaker?" "I was," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "A long time ago." "Who are you?" "My name is Leo Sterling. I'm a developer." I need to ask you about something you worked on. At the university. Project Blue Sky." A shudder came down behind his eyes. The friendly, curious old man vanished, replaced by someone wary and haunted. "That was 40 years ago," he said, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "A failure. Nothing came of it." "I don't think that's true," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. "Something came of it. I think it's happening now." I took a breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. People are seeing the sky differently. They're saying it's green, or slate gray. And the phenomenon is spreading. Concentrically. From somewhere near the old Tu-Wong transmitter. Whitaker went pale. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. He leaned against the door, his knuckles white. "Resonant cascade," he whispered, the words filled with a horrified, ancient awe. "I never thought, we ran the numbers. The energy required was too great. The signal would have degraded within meters." "What signal?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "What did you do?" He looked past me, up at the sky, his eyes unfocused. "It wasn't about changing the weather," he said, his voice distant. "Not really. That was the cover story, the justification for the funding. The real theory was, more ambitious." He explained it to me in his dusty, book-filled living room, the air thick with the smell of old paper and decaying memories. He spoke of quantum physics, of observer effects, of the plasticity of human perception. The project wasn't designed to change the atmosphere, but to change the observation of it. "We are all just receivers," he explained, his hands trembling as he sketched equations on a dusty notepad. "Our brains interpret a narrow band of electromagnetic radiation as color. What if that interpretation could be tuned? Nudged? We hypothesized that a persistent, extremely low-frequency wave, precisely calibrated, could create a cognitive harmonic. It wouldn't change the light waves, but it would change the brain's processing of them. A sort of perceptual virus, broadcast over the air." "You wanted to make people see a blue sky?" I asked, incredulous. "On gray, overcast days, yes," he admitted. "Imagine it. The ability to broadcast a perception of clear skies. To combat seasonal depression. To improve public morale. It was utopian. It was arrogant. It was dangerous. The project failed," he said, "because their equipment was too primitive. The signal was too weak, too unstable. It never achieved the required resonance. They shut it down, buried the research, and he retired under a cloud of academic ridicule." "But the broadcast," he whispered, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "We based it from the old ABC transmitter on Mount Kutha. We piggybacked on their tower. If someone reactivated it, with modern amplification, a digital signal. The stakes had just escalated from a bizarre psychological curiosity to a citywide technological assault on the very foundations of reality. It wasn't a contagion spreading from person to person. It was being broadcast. We were all living inside a bubble of altered perception, and the bubble was growing. Whitaker was my ally, but a broken one. The revelation had shattered him. He was a man confronted with the monstrous ghost of his youthful ambition. He helped me find his old research notes, boxes of them, filled with equations and theoretical models that made my head spin. But as we worked, I noticed something terrifying. I'd ask him about a specific frequency, and he would frown, confused. No, the key was in the modulation, not the frequency. Wasn't it? He'd look out the window at the sky. Such a strange, gray day, he'd murmur, on an afternoon so bright I had to squint. He was forgetting. His own theory, his life's work, was becoming hazy, the details slipping through his fingers like sand. The signal was tuning him, too. His immunity, built on knowledge and memory, was failing. My only ally was succumbing to the very thing we were trying to fight. The city itself was changing. The quiet wrongness was becoming organized. One afternoon, stuck in traffic on Coronation Drive, I saw a group of about 20 people gathered in a park by the river. They were standing in a loose circle, all of them staring up at the blue sky with the same placid, vacant expression. And they were humming. A low, monotonous, bass note that I could feel in my teeth, even with the car windows up. It was the sound of a dial tone for a disconnected reality. They weren't violent. They weren't threatening. But their shared, synchronized pointlessness was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. My app, my source of ground truth, was the next bastion to fall. It started with minor glitches. The temperature sensor data from the BOM would flicker, showing a reading 2 degrees cooler than it was for a split second. Then, the UV index started to flatline at low. Even at midday. I knew it was impossible. I called the bureau, frantically trying to explain that their public data feed was being corrupted. The technician on the other end was polite, but dismissive. All our instruments are reading normal on our end, mate. Maybe it's your software. He was one of them. Of course he was. The data wasn't being corrupted at the source. It was being corrupted at the point of reception. The signal wasn't just affecting human brains. It was beginning to affect digital sensors. The objective reality I had built my life around was being actively, malevolently rewritten. I was in my office, frantically trying to build a firewall, a filter, something to shield my app's data stream, when Chloe came over. She didn't say anything. She just placed a printed piece of paper on my desk. It was a list of therapists that specialized in stress and anxiety disorders. "We're worried about you, Leo," she said softly. I looked at her face, her kind, concerned eyes, and saw the face of the enemy. Not an enemy of malice, but of placid, unshakable consensus. "The sky is blue, Chloe," I said, my voice cracking. She looked out the window. "If you say so, Leo," she said, and the gentleness in her voice was like a knife. "But it's a lovely shade of green today, isn't it?" I watched her walk away. My ally was fading. My work was compromised. My friends thought I was losing my mind. I was truly, utterly alone, armed with a 40-year-old ghost story and a notebook full of frantic scribbles, fighting a war that nobody else knew was happening. The humming in the parks was getting louder. The flickers of green in my vision were lasting longer. The door was beginning to splinter. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the broadcast wasn't random. It was all coming from one place. The mountain that loomed over the city. Mount Kutha. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The drive to Mount Kutha felt like a pilgrimage to a cursed mountain. I had Whitaker's old maps, his faded diagrams of the ABC broadcast tower, the epicenter of his catastrophic utopian dream. My car stereo was off. I needed silence. I needed to hold on to the frequency of my own thoughts against the encroaching hum of the world. The sky, to my profound and desperate relief, remained blue. A fragile, precious blue I guarded with every glance. As I neared the turnoff for the summit, I saw the first signs. Cars were parked haphazardly along the shoulder of the road, doors left ajar. People were milling about on the grassy verges. Not in a panic, not in a rush. They moved with a slow, languid purposefulness. They were all drifting in one direction, up the mountain. I had to abandon my car a kilometer from the top. The road was blocked, not by a barrier, but by a silent, human congregation. Hundreds of them. They stood on the asphalt, in the dappled light filtering through the eucalyptus trees, all facing the summit. Some were staring at the sky. Others had their eyes closed. They weren't a mob, they were a congregation. A silent choir waiting for a note to be played. To get to the tower, I'd have to walk through them. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a physical confrontation I was prepared for. They weren't aggressive, but their sheer passivity was a wall. I took a breath and stepped onto the road, murmuring, "Excuse me, sorry, just need to get through." No one moved. No one acknowledged me. It was like walking through a forest of statues. Their eyes were distant, their faces serene. A young woman in a business suit stood next to an old man in board shorts. A family with 2 small children stood holding hands, their faces tilted towards the sky, smiling faintly. They were all listening to a song I couldn't hear. The silence of their collective focus was deafening. As I pushed deeper into the crowd, a low hum became audible. It wasn't just in my teeth anymore, it was in the air, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. It was the carrier wave. The signal. Whitaker's ghost. I finally broke through the silent throng and saw it. The huge, skeletal finger of the broadcast tower, pointing at the sky. At its base was not some high-tech, secret installation, but a simple, fenced-off compound with a small, windowless concrete bunker. The source. The gate was unlocked. Inside the compound, the hum was intense, a physical pressure against my eardrums. The door to the bunker was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was Spartan. A bank of modern, humming server racks, their blinking LEDs casting a rhythmic, hypnotic light. Wires and cables snaked across the floor, all converging on a single, central unit, a powerful, state-of-the-art signal amplifier. It was feeding a thick cable that ran up, out of the ceiling, towards the tower. This was it. The weather wand. The perception engine. There was a single laptop on a small desk, its screen glowing. It was open to a simple command line interface. And there, sitting in a cheap office chair, her back to me, was a figure. "Chloe." I whispered, my voice raw. She turned. Her face was calm, beatific. She gave me a soft, welcoming smile. It wasn't the concerned smile she'd given me in the office. This was a smile of absolute peace, of serene certainty. "Hello, Leo," she said. Her voice was even, devoid of the friendly cadence I knew so well. "I was wondering when you'd get here. I've been following your search." "You?" I was stunned. "Why?" "You call it aura weather," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "You love data. Truth. But you never understood what a weather app is really for. People don't want data, Leo. They want to feel good. They want a nice day." She patted the server rack beside her. "This provides that. It provides consensus. Harmony. No more anxiety about a cloudy day, no more arguments about the forecast. Just, peace. You're brainwashing an entire city." I yelled, the sound swallowed by the hum. "You're changing what they see, what they think." "We're not changing it," she corrected gently. We're just tuning it, upgrading it to a more pleasant frequency. The old reality was so chaotic, so disagreeably blue. She'd found Whitaker's research, I realized. She'd seen the same potential he had, but where he had the fearful wisdom of age, she had the ruthless optimism of a UX designer. She was improving the user experience of reality itself. My hand strayed to the main power conduit on the wall. The big red emergency off switch. I could end this. I could plunge the city back into the messy, argumentative, beautiful truth. Don't, she said, her voice still calm, but with an underlying firmness. You can't imagine the shock. The cognitive dissonance. It would be cruel to take this peace away from them. From us. She stood up and walked towards me. You've been fighting it for so long, Leo. You must be so tired. All that stress. All that isolation. Why are you clinging so hard to a reality that makes you miserable? She reached out and put her hand on my cheek. Her touch was cool. Just let go, she whispered. Just look outside. It's so much prettier now. And in that moment, under the immense pressure of the hum, of her voice, of my own bone-deep exhaustion, I did it. I stopped fighting. I let the door I'd been holding shut for weeks finally swing open. I turned my head and looked out the open bunker door, at the small patch of sky visible past the silent, waiting crowd. And the sky was green. It wasn't the sick, bruised, wrong green from my fleeting, panicked glimpses. It was a magnificent, luminous, breathtaking emerald. It was deep and calming, filled with a light that seemed to soothe every frayed nerve in my body. The constant, grinding anxiety that had been my companion for months, the fear, the isolation, the doubt, it all just dissolved. A wave of profound, tranquil relief washed over me. The green was beautiful. It was right. I looked back at Chloe. I saw her for the first time not as my employee, not as my friend, not as my adversary, but as my savior. She smiled, a real smile this time, one of recognition. See, she said. It's better. I nodded, a genuine, peaceful smile spreading across my own face. It is. The walk back down the mountain was different. I was no longer an intruder. I was part of the flow. I moved with the silent, serene crowd. I understood their quiet contentment. I looked up at the glorious green sky and felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. It was perfect. It had always been this color, hadn't it? The memory of blue was a phantom, a ghost of an old anxiety, a bad dream from which I had finally, thankfully, awoken. Underscore 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 underscore. A week later, I was back in my home office. The afternoon sun, filtering through the emerald sky, cast a soft, pleasant viridian glow across my desk. I was humming a low, calming tune. On my monitor, I brought up the code for Aura weather. Chloe was right. It was time for an upgrade. I started by deleting the old data caches. The satellite feeds, the BOM archives, all those terabytes of obsolete, disagreeably blue data. Useless. Then, I deleted my journal. I watched the folder containing the frantic, paranoid scribbles of that other man vanish into the recycling bin, and felt nothing but a distant pity for him. He had been so lost. My phone buzzed. A notification from the feedback portal. User underscore F89B1, small bug. App shows UV index as low, but it feels quite strong today. I smiled. A small calibration issue. An easy fix. I typed out a reply. Thank you for your feedback. We are working to harmonize all data streams. We appreciate your patience as we transition to a more stable reality. I looked out the window. The sky was a beautiful, consistent, peaceful green. Everything was finally in its right place. I was no longer an anomaly. I was part of the consensus. The signal was clear. And it was good. The turnaround man. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The number 192 bus is a long, articulated beast, a yellow caterpillar inching its way through the Manchester night. From my elevated seat, I am the city's nocturnal confessor, its silent witness. I see the last of the office workers, gray-faced and hollowed out, heading for Stockport. I see the students, bright and loud, spilling from the curry houses on Wilmslow Road. I see the lovers, huddled together against the perpetual Mancunian drizzle, their breath fogging the windows. And I see the lonely, the lost, the people who ride the bus to nowhere, just for the warmth and the motion. I am Arthur Penhaligon, and for 8 hours a night, this bus is my world. It's a world of routine. The hiss of the pneumatic doors, the cheerful but somehow sinister automated voice announcing, Piccadilly Gardens, the rumble of the diesel engine vibrating up through the soles of my worn work boots. The route is a rosary I count off in stops and starts, a fixed loop in the chaos of the city. I find comfort in it. After Eleanor left, comfort was a commodity in short supply. The predictable geometry of the route, the A to B to C, was a bomb on the raw, unpredictable mess of my life. The first time I saw him, I thought nothing of it. Just another drop in the city's ocean of oddity. It was a Tuesday, around 2 a.m., on the stretch past the old Apollo Theater. The streets were slick with a fresh coat of rain, reflecting the orange streetlights in wavering, distorted lines. He was standing on a corner under a flickering lamp, a tall, slender man in a dark, slightly too large coat. The light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the hollow of his cheek. He wasn't waiting for the bus, he was facing the wall of a shuttered newsagent. And he was turning. It wasn't a fast spin. It was a slow, deliberate rotation, clockwise. His feet shuffled almost silently on the wet pavement, a gradual, continuous pivot. I watched him in my side mirror as I pulled away from the stop. He completed a full circle and, without pausing, began another. A drunk, I thought. Or someone on drugs. Manchester has its share of both. I dismissed it and focused on the road ahead. The memory of him, however, stuck like a burr in my mind, the sheer pointlessness of the action, the quiet intensity of it. The next night, I saw him again. Same corner, same coat, same time. Same slow, inexorable turn. This time, I slowed the bus, peering out my window. There was no sign of intoxication. His movements were smooth, graceful even. He was like a human compass needle, trying to find a north that wasn't there. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced a line down my spine. By the fourth night, a knot of dread had taken permanent residence in my stomach. The sight of him was no longer a curiosity, it was an appointment. He was a fixed point in my shifting world, as reliable as the 2:17 a.m. stop at Ardwick Green. My mind raced, trying to build a rational framework around him. A performance artist? A man with a severe neurological condition? Someone engaged in a bizarre, private ritual? Each explanation felt thin, a flimsy bandage over something fundamentally strange. I mentioned it to Dave in the depot canteen the next morning. Dave has been driving the night shift for 20 years. His face is a road map of caffeine-fueled nights and stressful encounters, but his eyes are usually clear and steady. "See the weirdest thing last night," I said, stirring sugar into my tea. "Chap on the corner of Ardwick Lane, just, spinning. Slowly. Been there every night this week." Dave took a long slurp of his own tea, the mug rattling slightly in his hand. "Ah, yeah. The city's full of art. Don't you worry about it. You see all sorts. Had a woman once who tried to pay her fare with a bag of teeth. Real ones." He chuckled, but it sounded hollow. "No, this is different," I insisted. "It's methodical. He's always there. So, Maybe he lives there. Maybe he's a bloody ghost. Just keep your eyes on the road and your doors shut. That's the job. He picked up his keys from the table. I watched his hand. He was idly, almost unconsciously, twisting the key ring. Round and round and round between his thumb and forefinger. A smooth, repetitive motion. I stared at his hand, the words dying in my throat. The motion was a miniature echo of the man on the corner. A tiny, contained rotation. "Dave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Your keys." He glanced down, then back at me, his expression blank. "What about M?" He didn't stop the motion. "You're spinning them." He shrugged, a faint, placid smile touching his lips. "S'pose I am. Feels right. Feels right." The phrase snagged in my brain. It was an answer that wasn't an answer. It was a door slamming shut. He clapped me on the shoulder, the keys still turning, and walked away, leaving me alone at the sticky table, the dregs of my tea growing cold. The next few weeks were a descent into a quiet, private madness. I started seeing it everywhere. Not the full body turn, not yet. Just the echoes. The little spins. A young woman on the 192, her headphones on, twisting a silver ring on her finger. Endlessly. Her eyes were unfocused, her expression serene. A security guard at the university, sitting in his little hut, slowly rotating in his swivel chair. A quarter turn to the right, a quarter turn to the left. Back and forth. A contained, oscillating loop. When he caught me looking, he didn't scowl or look away. He just gave me that same placid, empty smile I'd seen on Dave. The dispatcher back at the depot, tracing circles on a dusty monitor with his fingertip. The cook in the canteen, stirring a pot of soup with a steady, circular motion long after it needed stirring, a look of sublime concentration on his face. Each instance was a tiny puncture in the fabric of my reality. Individually, they were nothing. A nervous tick. A habit. A moment of boredom. But together, they formed a pattern, a creeping web of wrongness. I felt like I was the only one with the key to the cipher, but the message it spelled was one I couldn't comprehend. My own world began to feel precarious. I'd grip the huge steering wheel of the bus and my hands would feel alien. I had to consciously resist the urge to make tiny, circular motions with my thumbs on its worn surface. I'd park the bus at the end of my shift and feel a strange pull, a physical suggestion to just turn the key in the ignition off and on, off and on. The turnaround man, as I'd come to call him in my head, was the epicenter. He was the patient zero of this quiet contagion. My obsession grew. I started to think of my route not as a way to get from A to B, but as a pilgrimage to his corner. The rest of the city, the passengers, the traffic, it was all just noise between the sightings. One night, driven by a fear I couldn't name, I did something I wasn't supposed to do. Approaching his corner, I saw him there, turning as always under the sickly orange light. Instead of continuing on my route down Ashton Old Road, I took a sharp, unscheduled left, wrestling the articulated bus down a narrow side street. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was breaking the loop, trying to prove he was just a man on a specific corner. A geographical anomaly. I drove a complicated, winding path through a warren of dark, residential streets, the bus groaning in protest. It took me 10 minutes to navigate back to the main road, rejoining my route a half-mile further down. My hands were slick with sweat. I felt a surge of triumphant relief. I had outsmarted him. I had broken the spell. Then I rounded a bend. Up ahead, perhaps 200 yards away, was another corner, this one outside a row of terraced houses. And under a streetlight, he was there. It was him. I knew it instantly. The same coat, the same height, the same unnerving stillness in his posture. He was standing on the pavement, facing a brick wall. And he was turning. Slowly, clockwise, as if he hadn't been on a different street moments ago, as if he had been waiting here for me all along. The bus seemed to shrink around me. The air grew thick and heavy. I wasn't on a route through Manchester anymore. I was on a route that led to him, and it didn't matter which streets I took. He wasn't a man on a corner. He was the corner. He was the destination. The low rumble of the engine suddenly sounded like a deep, guttural chuckle. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, and kept driving into the deepening night. The city was no longer my confessional. It was my cage, and the bars were beginning to spin. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The incident with the detour broke something in me. The flimsy wall of rationalization I had built to protect myself crumbled into dust. He wasn't bound by space. He wasn't a man. He was a phenomenon, a rule in a new and terrifying physics that only I seemed to be noticing. The feeling of isolation intensified, becoming a physical presence, a cold passenger who sat just behind my shoulder on every run. My life contracted. When I wasn't driving, I was in my small flat in Hume, the concrete architecture of the estate feeling more like a tomb than a home. I'd sleep for a few hours, a restless, dream-filled sleep where shadows spun in the corners of my vision, and wake up with a jolt, the ghost of a rotational pull in my own muscles. The rest of the time, I documented. I bought a cheap, hardbound notebook and a pack of black biros. I started a log. October 17, 2011. Ardwick Lane. The turnaround man, TM, present. Rain. 2 passengers on board. Female, approximate 20, twisting her headphone cord. Male, approximate 50, tapping a circle on the window with his wedding ring. Ping, ping, ping. Rhythmic. October 18, 1:23. Wilmslow Road. A group of 4 students at a bus stop. One of them, a lad in a parka, was slowly rotating a can of lager on the palm of his hand. His mates didn't seem to notice. Or care. They were all staring at their phones, thumbs swiping in smooth, circular motions over the glass screens. October 19, 2011. I took the detour again. He was there. Corner of Empress Street and Redcliffe Road. Waiting. How? How? The notebook became my only confidant. It was a repository for my fear, a futile attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos. Filling its pages was the only thing that felt sane. My interactions at the depot became a minefield. Dave's "feels right" had been a warning. I tried to talk to him again, a week after the detour incident. I cornered him by the grimy coffee machine. "Dave, you have to listen to me. It's getting worse." He turned from the machine, holding his mug. He was doing it again, swirling the contents with a gentle, continuous flick of the wrist. A perfect miniature vortex in a styrofoam cup. "What's getting worse, Art?" "The traffic on the A6. Tell me about it." His tone was light, but his eyes were distant. He was looking at me, but not seeing me. "No, the turning. The spinning. More people are doing it. And the man, the one I told you about, he's not just on one corner anymore. He moves. He's wherever I go." Dave took a slow sip of his coffee. "Maybe you need a break, mate. You're looking peaky. All these night shifts, they get to you. You start seeing things. Patterns that aren't there." "The pattern is there, Dave." My voice was louder than I intended. A few heads turned in the canteen. "You're doing it right now." "The coffee." He looked down at his mug as if noticing it for the first time. The swirling stopped. He looked back at me, and for a second, a flicker of something, confusion, fear, crossed his face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that placid, unnerving calm. "It helps it cool," he said simply. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing by the buzzing machine, feeling like a madman. That was the last time I tried to talk to anyone at work about it. I was on an island, and the tide of this quiet contagion was rising around me. The world was dividing into two groups, the turning and the oblivious. I was trapped in a third category, a horrifying purgatory of one, the seeing. My search for answers turned inwards, and then backwards. If this was happening, had it happened before? The depot was an old institution. Drivers came and went. Some retired, some moved on, some didn't. There were stories, depot myths passed around on long nights. Whispers of drivers who had lost their marbles. The name that kept coming up was Hemlock. Old Man Hemlock. He'd driven the night shift for 30 years before his retirement, about a decade ago. The story went that he'd gone funny in his last year. Started talking nonsense about the city breathing and the wheels of the world. He'd been forced into early retirement after an incident where he'd just stopped his bus in the middle of Piccadilly Gardens and refused to move, claiming the pattern was wrong. Hemlock became my new obsession. He was my subplot, my red herring, my desperate hope that I wasn't the first. Getting information wasn't easy. Personnel records were locked down tighter than Fort Knox. But depots run on paper and neglect. In a dusty, forgotten storage room at the back of the building, amidst stacks of old route maps and faded health and safety posters, I found a cache of old incident report binders. They were covered in a thick layer of grime, smelling of damp and decay. I spent my pre-shift hours hunched in that cold room, flipping through brittle, yellowed pages with a torch, my breath pluming in the air. Most of it was mundane stuff: wing mirrors clipped, fare dodgers reported, breakdowns on the Mancunian Way. But then I found it. A binder from 12 years ago. And a cluster of reports about a driver named H. Hemlock. The first few were standard. Then they got strange. Driver Hemlock reported a stationary disturbance on his route. No physical obstruction found. Driver Hemlock reported feeling a compulsive directional pull, causing him to deviate from the prescribed route. Given a verbal warning. Driver Hemlock stopped his vehicle for 15 minutes, stating he was waiting for the turning to stop. Passengers reported he seemed distressed, staring at a blank brick wall. My heart hammered. It was him. It had happened to him. The final report was thicker. It detailed the Piccadilly Gardens incident. It included a short, transcribed interview with Hemlock, conducted by a depot manager. "Manager, why did you stop the bus, Harold?" Hemlock, "The spin. It was too fast. All of them. In the square. It wasn't right. Had to wait for it to settle." Manager, "The spin. What spin? There was nothing there." Hemlock, "Can't you see it? The whole world, it's a turntable. God's the DJ. And tonight, he's scratching the record." The report concluded with a recommendation for immediate medical leave and assessment. After that, Harold Hemlock vanished from the records. I had found my proof. I wasn't mad. Or, if I was, it was a madness with a precedent. This discovery didn't bring relief. It brought a deeper, colder fear. Hemlock had seen it, and it had broken him. What chance did I have? The contagion continued its silent spread. It was more organized now. One night, I stopped outside the central library. The grand, circular reading room glowed from within. Through the huge windows, I could see them. A dozen people, dotted amongst the tables. Each one was engaged in a small, rotational act. One was spinning a pen. Another was turning a page of a book, then turning it back. A third was slowly rotating their head from side to side. It was a silent, synchronized ballet of pointless loops. They were separate, yet they felt connected, nodes in a network I couldn't see. The environmental warping began, subtle at first. I'd see spiral patterns in the condensation on the bus windows, too perfect to be natural. The reflection of streetlights on a puddle would seem to swirl for a moment, like cream in coffee. The hum of the engine, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat, would sometimes seem to resolve into a low, circular chant, a single, looping syllable just on the edge of hearing. Turn, 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 turn. I started taking pictures with my phone. Grainy, low-light photos of people twisting key rings, of the strange patterns on the windows, of the turnaround man on his ever-shifting corners. My photo gallery became a mosaic of my own paranoia. But when I looked at the pictures in the harsh light of my flat, they looked like nothing. Just a blurry man on a street. Just a woman with a nervous habit. The camera couldn't capture the wrongness. The wrongness was in the context, in the repetition, in the feeling. It was a truth that couldn't be proven. One afternoon, desperate for a different perspective, I went to the John Rylands library. I thought maybe, in the ancient books, in the folklore, I'd find a mention of something like this. A dancing plague, a St. Vitus's dance for the 21st century. I found nothing. As I was leaving, a young woman at the exit stopped me. "Excuse me," she said. "You dropped this." She was holding out my depot ID card. She had bright, intelligent eyes and a curious smile. She wasn't one of them. I felt it instantly. There was no placid emptiness in her gaze, no hint of a repetitive tick in her hands. "Oh. Thanks." I fumbled, taking it from her. "You're a bus driver?" she asked, her curiosity genuine. "That must be interesting. Seeing the city when it's asleep." Her name was Elise. She was a postgraduate student studying urban folklore and psychogeography, the study of how the physical environment affects the mind. When she said that, a jolt went through me. It was too perfect. You wouldn't happen to have any theories about compulsive movements, would you?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Like, people all developing the same tic. The same pointless action." Elisa's eyes lit up. "That's fascinating. Like a mimetic virus? An idea that spreads like a contagion. There are theories, of course. Mirror neurons, mass hysteria. What kind of action?" I hesitated, standing on the precipice. Could I trust her? Could I risk sounding like a lunatic? The loneliness was a crushing weight. I had to tell someone. Turning, I said, my voice low. "Spinning. In circles." She didn't laugh. She didn't back away. She leaned in closer, her expression one of intense academic interest. "Tell me everything," she said. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, but it was there. I had found an ally. Or so I thought. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Elise became my anchor. We met for coffee in the northern quarter, surrounded by the trendy and the normal, and it felt like I was a spy coming in from the cold. I told her everything. I showed her my notebook, my blurry photos, my frantic scrawls. I told her about the turnaround man, about Dave and his coffee cup, about Old Man Hemlock. To my astonishment, she absorbed it all with a terrifying seriousness. She didn't treat me like a patient, she treated me like a primary source. She cross-referenced my sightings with maps, she theorized, she built frameworks. "This isn't hysteria," she said one afternoon, her finger tracing a line on a map of my route. "Hysteria is chaotic. This is structured. It's organized. The turnaround man, you say he's always on a corner? Corners are points of transition, liminal spaces. And the turning, a circle, is the oldest symbol in the world. It represents unity, infinity, completion. But also enclosure. A trap." She proposed a theory that was both more terrifying and more validating than anything I could have imagined. What if it's not psychological? What if it's geographical? Or something using the geography? Think of the city not as a collection of buildings, but as a circuit board. Certain points, corners, crossroads, old places, are nodes. The people, they're not getting sick. They're being tuned. They're becoming receivers for a signal that's being broadcast. A signal? From what? I asked, my voice hoarse. I don't know. Something ancient, maybe. Something that was here before the city, that the city was unknowingly built upon. Or something new. Some kind of emergent consciousness born from the network itself. The hum of the grid, the flow of data, the endless repetition of traffic and people. Maybe the city itself is waking up, and this is how it communicates. This is how it brings its component parts, the people, into alignment. Her words painted a picture of a world I didn't want to live in. A world where free will was a neurological illusion, and we were all just puppets twitching on the strings of some vast, unseen intelligence. With Elisa's help, my investigation gained a grim focus. We dug into the history of the places where I'd seen the turnaround man. Many of them were sites of old mills, ancient crossroads, or places where ley lines were rumored to intersect, according to Elisa's esoteric maps. There was a logic to it, a deep, ancient grammar beneath the concrete skin of the city. The search for Hemlock led us to a retirement home in Sale, a sterile, beige building that smelled of disinfectant and regret. The staff were reluctant to let us see him, citing his delicate condition. But Elise, with her academic credentials and persuasive charm, got us a 10-minute visit. Harold Hemlock was a husk of a man, shrunken into a wheelchair by a window overlooking a small, meticulously manicured lawn. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but they fixed on me as I entered. "The 192, he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You drive the 192. "Yes," I said, kneeling beside his chair. "Mr. Hemlock, I need to ask you about what you saw." "About the turning." A light flickered in the depths of his eyes. "Fear." "You see it too, then, son. The great wheel. It's speeding up. It used to be slow. A gentle waltz. Now it's a spin. Tries to pull you in. Tries to make you part of the pattern." "The man," I pressed. "The man on the corner." Hemlock's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "He's not a man. He's the axle. He's the point it all turns on. Don't look at him. If you look at him, he sees you. And he knows you're not turning. He knows you're a broken cog in the machine." His breathing grew ragged. A nurse bustled in, telling us our time was up. As she wheeled him away, Hemlock looked back over his shoulder, his voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "It wants us all to turn the same way. To face the same direction. When we all face the same way, the door will open. The door will open." The words echoed in my mind all the way back into the city. A door to what? Or from what? The stakes were escalating. The anomaly was no longer content with subtle ticks. One night, as I drove through Rusholme, I saw a crowd gathered outside a takeaway. It wasn't a fight or an accident. It was about 30 people, standing in the street, all turning. Slowly, in unison. Their faces were blank, serene. Traffic was swerving around them. Other drivers honked, but nobody stopped. It was as if this was now a normal feature of the urban landscape, a human fountain, a living sculpture. Their synchronized movements were beautiful and utterly horrifying. They were a choir, and the turnaround man was their conductor. My own battle against the compulsion was becoming a physical struggle. The pull to spin things was immense. I had to tape down the dial on my radio to stop myself from twisting it. I couldn't hold keys or coins in my hand. The worst was the steering wheel. It felt so natural, so right, to just turn it. sharply. To join the spin. More than once, I had to pull over, my body shaking, fighting a war inside my own skin. The signal was getting stronger, and my resistance was failing. Elise was my only lifeline. We'd talk for hours on the phone after my shifts. She'd listen to my panicked reports and try to calm me, her voice a shield against the encroaching madness. She was trying to find a counter-frequency, a way to break the signal. She spoke of sacred geometry, of dissonant sounds, of finding a still point in the turning world. I think I'm close to something, Art, she told me one evening, her voice fizzing with excitement over the phone. The patterns the turnaround man is making on the map, they're not random. It's a spiral. An Archimedean spiral. And I think I know where the center is. Where it all began. An old, disused telephone exchange under Piccadilly Gardens. What's there? I asked, a knot of ice forming in my gut. I don't know. Maybe the heart of the network. The source of the broadcast. I'm going to go and check it out. There's an old service entrance I found on a 1950s city plan. Elise, no. It's too dangerous. Don't go alone. I have to, Art. This is it. This is the answer. I'll call you the second I find anything. Stay by the phone. She hung up before I could argue. I paced my small flat, the city lights outside seeming to whirl and spin. Hours passed. My shift was due to start. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. I abandoned my shift, telling the dispatcher I was sick. I ran from my flat, hailing a cab to Piccadilly Gardens. The square was unnaturally quiet. The usual crowds of late-night revelers were gone. There were just figures. Dotted around the gardens, standing still. I found the service entrance she'd mentioned, a heavy iron door set into a concrete wall, hidden behind overgrown bushes. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and descended into the darkness, using my phone's torch. The air was cold and smelled of ozone and damp earth. A long concrete corridor stretched out before me. At the far end, there was a faint light. I moved towards it, my footsteps echoing loudly. I reached a vast chamber filled with racks of silent, obsolete machinery. Wires hung like dead vines. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, bare bulb, was a swivel chair. Elise was sitting in it. Elise? I called out, my voice trembling with relief. She didn't answer. She was facing away from me. Then, she began to turn. Slowly, clockwise, the chair emitting a faint, rhythmic squeak. Squeak, squeak, squeak. She turned all the way around to face me. Her face was utterly, completely blank. The intelligent, vibrant woman I knew was gone, replaced by a placid, empty vessel. Her eyes were unfocused. A faint, serene smile was on her lips. Elise, what happened? What did you find? I begged. She looked at me, but it was like looking at a stranger. Her head tilted slightly. It's so quiet down here, she said, her voice a soft, melodic monotone. You can feel the whole city turning. Like a big, warm engine. She continued her slow rotation, turning away from me again. On the floor beside her chair was her notebook. It was open. On the page, in her familiar handwriting, was a single, spiraling sentence, written over and over again, starting in the middle and winding its way out to the edges of the page. It feels right, it feels right, it feels right, it feels right, it feels right. My ally was gone. The hope she had given me curdled into abject terror. I wasn't just investigating the contagion anymore. I was its next target. I stumbled backwards out of that concrete tomb, leaving Elise to her endless, peaceful turning. I ran up the stairs and burst back out into the night. The figures in the square had started to move. All of them, in perfect, silent unison, had begun their slow, inexorable turn. The machine was almost fully assembled. And I was the last broken piece. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. Fleeing the underground exchange, I ran without thinking, a raw animal panic propelling me through the empty streets. But there was no escape. The city itself had become the monster. On Market Street, the mannequins in the shop windows had been turned to face the back walls. The revolving doors of office buildings spun slowly, rhythmically, powered by an unseen hand. The world was conforming, pixel by pixel, to the new, rotational logic. I made it back to the depot, my lungs burning. My bus, the 192, was waiting for me under the yellow security lights, a familiar yellow beast in a world of alien motion. It was the only thing that felt like mine. I climbed into the driver's seat, the worn fabric a small, pathetic comfort. The urge, the pull to join the spin, was a physical thing now, a tide rising within me. My hands shook. My teeth chattered. I had to fight the instinct to simply turn the steering wheel all the way to the lock and hold it there. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't a plan born of courage, but of desperation. I had to face the axle. I had to go back to the beginning. I started the engine, the deep rumble of familiar prayer. I pulled out of the depot, not on my designated route, but on a new one. A final one. I drove towards Ardwick Lane, the corner where it had all started. The city was a ghost town populated by spinning statues. A lone cyclist in the middle of a crossroads, slowly circling. A dog in a garden, chasing its tail in a perfect, unending loop. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the hum of my engine and the soft, rhythmic scuffing of 1,000 turning shoes on wet pavement. They were all tuning in. The signal was reaching its peak. As I approached the corner, I saw him. The turnaround man. He was standing in his original spot, under the flickering lamp. But he was different now. He wasn't just a man in a coat anymore. The space around him seemed to warp and shimmer. The light of the street lamp didn't so much illuminate him as get drawn into him. He was a vortex, a singularity in the fabric of the night. This was the confrontation. Not with fists or words, but with will. I stopped the bus 50 feet away, the headlights pinning him like a specimen. He didn't react. He just continued his slow, majestic turn, the absolute center of his turning world. And the pull hit me. It was no longer a gentle suggestion. It was a physical force, a giant, invisible hand on my soul, twisting me. My head involuntarily turned to the right. My right foot wanted to press down on the accelerator and drive the bus in a tight, screaming circle. My hands wanted to wrench the wheel. I gripped it until my knuckles were bone white, my whole body rigid with the effort of resistance. Turn, a voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't a sound, it was a thought placed there from the outside. Turn with us. Be complete. The door is opening. Don't be left outside. Sweat poured down my face. A groan escaped my lips. I looked from the turnaround man back to my own hands on the wheel. And in that moment of unbearable pressure, I understood. The horror wasn't in the turning itself. The horror was in being the only one not turning. The agony was in the resistance. Hemlock was wrong. He wasn't a broken cog. He was a cog trying to turn against the direction of the entire machine. That was the source of the madness. The friction. The choice was simple. Brake, or turn. My grip on the steering wheel relaxed. I took a deep, shuddering breath and let the pressure, the force, have its way. Just a little. I didn't wrench the wheel. I didn't slam the accelerator. I simply allowed my right wrist to rotate. A small, almost imperceptible motion. Then my left. I sat there in the driver's seat of the 192, under the humming lights. And slowly, deliberately, I began to rotate my wrists in small, continuous circles. The pressure vanished. The screaming tension in my body dissolved into a strange, profound calm. The voice in my head went silent. The world outside didn't change, the turnaround man kept turning, but my perception of it shifted. It was no longer terrifying. It was harmonic. I could feel it now, the thrum of the city, the great, slow rotation of it all. It wasn't malicious. It was just a new state of being. A new fundamental law of physics had asserted itself, and the universe was simply settling into its new shape. I looked at the turnaround man, the axle of the world. He completed a rotation, and for a single, impossible instant, his head lifted and he looked directly at me. There was no face under the shadow of his coat, just a deeper darkness. And in that darkness, I felt not a threat, but a nod of acknowledgement. Welcome. I put the bus in gear and drove away. I didn't go back to the depot. I just drove, making my own route through the silent, spinning city. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant. A quiet, mobile part of the new machine. Underscore 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 underscore. I don't drive the bus anymore. I left it parked by the canal at Salford Quays, the doors open, a yellow husk shedding its last few oblivious passengers into the new world. I live in my flat. The world outside has settled. The turning is the new normal. It's not all the time, for everyone. It comes and goes, like the rain. Sometimes you'll see whole crowds turning in a park. Other times, it's just the quiet, unconscious spin of a stranger's ring on the tram. No one talks about it. There's nothing to say. It's just the way things are. I found my own rhythm. I don't fight it. That way lies madness. I have a small, polished river stone I keep in my pocket. When the urge comes, when I feel the great wheel of the city begin to turn, I take it out. I place it in the palm of my hand and I slowly, gently, rotate it with my thumb. Round and round and round. It's a small motion. A contained motion. My own private prayer to the new reality. It is my compromise. My surrender. It keeps the pressure at bay. It makes me part of the pattern, but on my own terms. I am not the axle, and I am not a broken cog. I am just a man, finding his place in the spin. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city is quiet and the thrum is strongest, I stand in the center of my living room, close my eyes, and I allow myself a single, slow rotation. And for a terrifying, peaceful moment, it feels completely and utterly right. The first thing I noticed was the ink. It wasn't a smudge or a leak from my favorite Pilot G2. It was a deliberate, perfect obliteration. A solid, light-swallowing black rectangle where a name should have been. I was sitting at my desk in the bustling, open-plan newsroom of the Chicago Chronicle, the Monday morning light streaming through the massive windows overlooking the river, turning the dust motes into a swirling galaxy. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial-strength carpet cleaner, and the faint, ever-present anxiety of impending deadlines. My notes were spread across my desk, a chaotic mosaic of legal pads, printouts, and cocktail napkins. I was piecing together a long-form article on the current administration's contentious trade policy, a dense thicket of tariffs, treaties, and political maneuvering. I'd spent the weekend interviewing a source, a disgruntled former staffer who had spoken in hushed, urgent tones in a noisy bar in the Loop. His words were gold. And now, the most important ones were gone. The decision came directly from, my scrawl read. The black box was absolute. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. I hadn't done that. I never redact my own raw notes. I flipped the page. Another quote. Everyone in the room knew was driving the agenda. Another perfect, impenetrable void. I pushed my chair back, the wheels squeaking in protest. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I scanned the rest of my notes. It was everywhere. Every mention of the President of the United States, redacted. Not just his name, but his title in certain contexts. The policy was a cornerstone of the S platform. Stress, I mumbled to myself, rubbing my temples. You're just stressed, Sarah. I'd been burning the candle at both ends. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. Maybe I'd done it myself in some weird, fugue state of exhaustion. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was all I had. I took a deep breath and stood up, smoothing down my wrinkled blouse. Time for a coffee refill and a human interaction to reset my brain. I walked towards the communal kitchen, the newsroom a familiar symphony of chaos around me. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and a heated argument about the Oxford comma was erupting near the sports desk. Normalcy. Mark, one of our senior editors, was leaning against the counter, staring into his mug like it held the secrets of the universe. He was a good editor, sharp and unflappable, with a mind like a steel trap for facts and figures. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to sound casual as I grabbed a clean mug. "My brain's completely fried this morning." He grunted, a standard pre-caffeine response. "Help me out," I continued, pouring the sludgy black coffee. "I'm blanking on the simplest thing. I was just writing up my notes on the trade deal, and I'm staring at a sentence about, the big guy." Mark looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. "The big guy?" "Yeah. I gestured vaguely towards the ceiling. "The President." A strange pause hung in the air between us. It wasn't the pause of someone searching their memory. It was a different kind of quiet, a placid, uncurious blankness. "Right," he said, his tone flat. "That guy." He took a sip of his coffee and turned his gaze back to his mug. My own mug stopped halfway to my lips. "Yeah, that guy," I repeated, testing the words. "But his name. It's completely slipped my mind." One of those brain fart moments. Mark shrugged, a gesture so casual it was jarring. "Happens to the best of us." He pushed himself off the counter. "Let me know when you have a draft of that trade piece. I want to see it by 3. He walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen alcove. The coffee in my mug was suddenly cold. It wasn't just that he couldn't remember, it was that he didn't care. Mark, the man who once sent back a draft because I'd used the wrong tonnage for a decommissioned aircraft carrier, couldn't be bothered to recall the name of the sitting President of the United States. I felt a prickle of something cold and sharp, like a sliver of ice sliding down my spine. I walked back to my desk, my steps feeling heavy, disconnected. I sat down and looked at the black rectangles again. They seemed darker now, more absolute. I turned to my computer, the screen's glow a familiar comfort. I opened a browser window, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The simple act of typing the query felt momentous, absurd. Current U.S. President. I hit enter. The search results flooded the screen. Headlines from the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times. I scanned them, my heart thumping a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. Administration unveils new infrastructure plan. A contentious week on Capitol Hill for the White House. Analysts weigh in on recent executive order. The words were all there. The articles were detailed, filled with quotes from senators, policy experts, and press secretaries. But the name, the central pillar around which all this information should have been structured, was gone. It was replaced by placeholders so seamless, so grammatically correct, that you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. The President, the administration, the nation's leader, he. Never a name. I clicked on the official White House website. The biography page was there. It had a photo. A man in his late 60s, graying hair, a standard political smile. But where his name should have been, the header simply read, the 46th President of the United States. The body of the text was a masterpiece of vagueness. He began his career in public service, his policy focuses on, it was like reading a template. My breath hitched. This wasn't me. This wasn't stress. I swiveled in my chair and looked out at the newsroom. Dozens of journalists, people whose entire careers were built on the bedrock of verifiable facts, were typing, talking, working. None of them seemed to notice that a fundamental piece of their shared reality had been scooped out, leaving a hollow space behind. I thought of my sister, Amy. She was a high school history teacher. If anyone would know, she would. I pulled out my cell phone, my thumb shaking slightly as I scrolled to her contact. "Hey, Sarah, what's up?" Her voice was cheerful, a little distracted. I could hear the chatter of teenagers in the background. She must be on her lunch break. "Hey, Ames. Got a weird question for you. A bit of a trivia thing for a story I'm working on." I tried to keep my voice light. "Shoot. Who's the current president?" The line went quiet for a moment. I heard the distant slam of a locker. "Oh, you know," she said finally, her voice carrying the same strange, placid tone as Mark's. "That guy. The one after the last one." "Right, but his name," I pushed, a knot of desperation tightening in my chest. "I need his name for the piece." "His name," she repeated, as if the concept of him having one was a novel idea. "Huh. You know, I don't think I've ever actually thought about it. It's just, him. The president." I could almost hear her shrug. "Is it important? Is it important?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Amy, you teach history. The name of the sitting president seems pretty damn important." "Well, yeah, I guess," she said, sounding vaguely apologetic, but not concerned. "Look, Sarah, the bell's about to ring. I've gotta go. We're doing the Reconstruction era today. Talk later." "Wait, Amy." But she had already hung up. I sat there, phone in my hand, the newsroom noise fading into a dull roar. The Reconstruction era. She could remember the details of post-Civil War America, but not the man leading the country now. I looked back at my notes, at the blacked-out name. It felt like a wound on the page, a physical manifestation of a hole that had opened in the world. I picked up my pen and, on a clean sheet of paper, I wrote, Phase 1, The Unsettling Mundane. A grim joke, but it felt necessary. To document. To prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. I tried to work on the trade story, but the words swam in front of my eyes. Every reference to the faceless, nameless man in the White House felt like a lie. I watched my colleagues. I listened to their conversations. They talked about policy, about political fallout, about approval ratings. They talked around the void. They never fell into it. They navigated the empty space with an unconscious, terrifying grace. That evening, I walked home instead of taking the L. I needed the cold Chicago air to clear my head. The city felt different. The familiar skyline, the canyon of buildings, the rumble of traffic, it was all the same, but my perception of it had shifted. It was like looking at a photograph of a place you love, a perfect replica that lacks the intangible essence of the real thing. I stopped at a bodega to pick up milk. The man behind the counter, Mr. Chen, who had sold me overpriced groceries for 5 years, had the news on a small, crackling television perched on a shelf. A press conference was on. The press secretary, a woman whose face I knew but whose name now escaped me, was at the podium. "The president has full confidence in the Secretary of Defense," she said, her expression stern. "But what did he say about the troop movements?" a reporter shouted from the faceless crowd. Mr. Chen shook his head. "This guy," he said to me, bagging my milk. "Always making trouble." "Which guy?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He gestured with his chin towards the television. You know. The president. He's no good. What's his name? I asked, my eyes locked on his. Mr. Chen paused, his hands stilling on the plastic bag. He looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, quickly replaced by that same vacant smoothness. His name? It's, you know. It's him. The president. He shrugged and handed me my change. $1.25. The casual dismissal was more horrifying than any argument would have been. I walked out of the store, the plastic bag crinkling in my numb hand. The streetlights were beginning to hum to life, casting long, distorted shadows down the block. I looked up at them, at the familiar orange glow against the deepening twilight. For a split second, they seemed to flicker in a pattern, a rhythmic pulse that felt less like an electrical fault and more like a signal. ... I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again. The lights were steady. Just normal streetlights on a normal Chicago street. I hurried home, my heart pounding. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt alien. I locked the door, leaning against it as if I could physically block out the wrongness of the world. I dropped the milk on the counter and went straight to my bookshelf. I pulled out a political science textbook from my college days, a heavy tome with a glossy picture of the Capitol building on the cover. I flipped to the section on the executive branch. I ran my finger down the list of presidents. Washington, Adams, Jefferson. Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy. Reagan, Clinton, Obama. And then the list just stopped. The entry for the 45th president was there. But after that, nothing. Blank pages. Not ripped out, just pristine, empty, waiting for a history that had apparently failed to be recorded. I sank to the floor, the heavy book in my lap. This was not a shared delusion. This was an erasure. A quiet, creeping contagion of forgetting. And for some reason, I was immune. I could see the holes, the gaps in the fabric of reality. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The next few weeks were a slow-motion descent into a private hell. I developed a set of rules, a survival guide for the quietly insane. Rule number 1, don't ask about the president. Don't point out the blank spaces. Don't draw attention to the fade. Every time I had tried, it was like pushing against a wall of soft, yielding foam. I'd be met with that same placid confusion, that gentle, patronizing concern. Sarah, are you feeling okay? You seem a little fixated. The looks they gave me made me feel like a glitch, a faulty line of code in an otherwise smooth-running program. So I played along. I learned to speak the new language of vagueness. At work, I wrote my articles using the accepted placeholders. The administration, the White House, sources close to the president. My editor, Mark, praised my work. This is good, Sarah. Lean. To the point. It was a chilling compliment. I was being lauded for my ability to write around a void, to pretend the central character of my beat didn't exist. My isolation became a physical thing, a bubble of silence I carried with me through the noisy city. I felt like I was watching the world through a sheet of thick glass. I saw people's mouths move, I heard the sounds, but the meaning was distorted, hollowed out. The contagion wasn't loud or violent. It was a creeping, silent subtraction. And it was spreading. It started with other proper nouns. One afternoon, during a pitch meeting, a colleague was talking about a potential story on urban renewal projects. They're planning to gentrify that whole area over in, you know. That neighborhood west of the river. The one with all the galleries. Pilsen. I offered, the name popping into my head automatically. He stared at me. The what? Pilsen, I repeated, my voice smaller. The neighborhood. He shook his head, a slow, uncomprehending motion. No, I don't think that's it. Anyway, they're pouring a lot of money into that place. No one else in the room corrected him. No one else supplied the name. They just nodded along, their collective memory having sealed over another fact. I felt a wave of nausea. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were wide, haunted. Am I the only one who remembers Pilsen? I started testing it, subtly at first. I'd mention movie titles. Some were fine. Everyone remembered Star Wars. But when I brought up Casablanca, my friends looked at me with polite blankness. The one with the guy in the hat, my friend Maya offered. In the place with the sand? Yes, I'd say, my heart sinking. In Casablanca. Right. In that city. Great movie. The name of the city, the title of the film, had been sandpapered away, leaving only a rough description. But the story remained. They remembered the plot, the characters, well, the guy in the hat and the woman he loved. The emotional core was intact, but the specific identifiers, the anchors to our shared cultural map, were being pulled up, one by one. Music was next. I was in a coffee shop, and a song came on the radio. A soaring guitar solo, a raw, powerful voice. Classic rock. I love this song, I said to the barista, a young woman with pink hair and a septum piercing. Me too, she said, smiling. It's from that one band, you know. The British one with the 4 guys. Led Zeppelin, I said. Her smile faltered, replaced by that familiar look of vacant non-recognition. The Who? Not Led Zeppelin, I thought, a cold dread seeping into me. Please, not them. I began to document everything in a locked journal, a small, black moleskine I kept hidden in a loose floorboard under my bed. I called it my Archive of the Lost. I wrote down the names of presidents, cities, bands, books, scientific theories. Every time I noticed a new omission in the world, I would write it down, a desperate act of preservation. The journal became my only confidant, the only proof that the world I remembered had ever existed. My paranoia grew teeth. I started to see patterns where there were none, or maybe there were. I began noticing a piece of graffiti, a strange symbol, popping up around the city. It was a simple design, a circle with a single, horizontal line drawn through its center. It looked like the Greek letter theta, or maybe a minimalist drawing of a setting sun. I saw it spray-painted on the side of a bridge near the river, scrawled in marker on the back of a bus stop bench, even etched into the wood of a table at my local library. At first, I dismissed it as just another gang tag or a street artist's signature. But it seemed to appear in places connected to the fade. I saw one on the pedestal of a statue in Lincoln Park, a statue of a historical figure whose name no one seemed to recall anymore. He was just the guy on the horse. I found another one on the wall of a record store that had a whole section labeled simply, Rock Music, 1960s to 1970s. The specificity was dissolving, being replaced by broad, clumsy categories. The symbol felt like a tombstone, a marker for something that had died. I tried to research the symbol online, but it was impossible. How do you Google a circle with a line through it? My search queries brought up everything from mathematical symbols to corporate logos. It was a ghost in the machine, visible only to me. My search for answers drove me to the city's archives, the places where history was meant to be set in stone. I started spending my lunch breaks at the Harold Washington Library, its grand, ornate architecture a stark contrast to the decay I was witnessing. I'd pull old newspapers on microfiche, my eyes straining at the glowing text. The older the record, the more intact it seemed. Newspapers from the 80s and 90s still had the president's name. But when I looked at digitized versions of the same articles on the Chronicle's internal server, the names were gone, replaced by the now familiar placeholders. The fade was retroactive. It wasn't just hollowing out the present, it was rewriting the past. This discovery pushed me from a state of passive observation to active investigation. I was a journalist, damn it. My job was to find the truth, to uncover the story. And this was the biggest, most terrifying story of all time. The problem was, I had no sources. My only source was my own memory, and in a world that unanimously disagreed with me, that made me a source of one. A madwoman. My relationship with my sister Amy frayed. I couldn't help myself. I'd call her, trying to find a new way in, a new angle to make her see. Amy, remember when we went to Washington, D.C. for your 8th grade trip? I asked her one night. Of course, she said. We saw all the monuments. Right. And we went to the museum. The one with the planes. Yeah, the big air and space one. It was cool. What was the name of the first man on the moon, Amy? A pause. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. You know, she said, and her voice had a defensive edge to it I hadn't heard before. The astronaut. The one with the flag. Neil Armstrong, I said, the name feeling sacred, a charm against the encroaching silence. His name was Neil Armstrong. Sarah, why are you doing this? She asked, her voice suddenly strained. Why are you so obsessed with all these little details? It's weird. It's not like you. They're not little details, Amy. They're everything. They're our history. Our history is that a man walked on the moon, she snapped. The name isn't the important part. I have to go. I have lesson plans to finish. She hung up before I could reply. I was losing her. I was losing everyone. I was an island, and the tide of forgetting was rising all around me. The symbol was my only lead. This strange, circular mark. It had to mean something. It was the only new thing that had appeared while everything else was disappearing. It was an addition, not a subtraction. That felt significant. I started carrying a small notebook with me everywhere, separate from my secret journal. In it, I sketched the symbol and noted the exact location of every sighting. The wall of the old courthouse. A bricked-up doorway in an alley behind the Symphony Hall. The base of a water tower. Places of civic importance. Places of cultural memory. Places of historical record. The symbol was always there, a silent witness to the erasure. My investigation led me to a dead end. I found an old, obscure academic paper from the University of Chicago, published in the late 1990s. It was written by a sociology professor, a Dr. Alastair Finch, who had since passed away. The paper was titled Conceptual Entropic Decay, a Theory of Informational Contagion. My hands trembled as I read the scanned PDF. Finch's theory was terrifyingly prescient. He hypothesized that in a hyper-connected, information-saturated society, certain concepts could become redundant. That the collective consciousness, in an effort to streamline itself, might begin to discard specific, inefficient data points, like names and proper nouns, in favor of broader, more functional archetypes. He called it a cognitive virus that would spread not through malice, but through apathic consensus. People wouldn't be forced to forget, they would simply, quietly, collectively agree to. The most chilling part was a footnote on the final page. Early markers of such a decay may not present as memory loss, but as the emergence of new, simplified semiotics to represent these hollowed-out concepts. My blood ran cold. I printed out the page and drew the symbol next to the footnote. A new, simplified semiotic. A symbol for a hollowed-out concept. Was this symbol the placeholder for everything that was lost? A universal icon for the thing we no longer name? Armed with this terrifying theory, I decided to take a huge risk. I wrote a piece. Not for the Chronicle, but for myself. A coded story, disguised as a piece of speculative fiction, about a city that slowly loses its memory. I described the fade, the placid denial, the creeping sense of dread. I didn't name names, I couldn't, but I described the phenomenon perfectly. I ended the piece with a description of a strange symbol that began appearing all over the fictional city. A circle with a line through it. I submitted it to a small, independent online literary journal, one that prided itself on publishing transgressive work. A week later, I got an email. They wanted to publish it. A flicker of hope ignited in me. Maybe someone else would read it. Maybe someone else out there saw what I saw. Maybe I wasn't alone. The day it was published, I felt a nervous energy I hadn't felt in months. I checked the website compulsively. There it was. My name, my story. I read it over, and for a moment, I felt sane. The words were a perfect reflection of my reality. That evening, I sent the link to Mark, my editor. I didn't say anything, just the link. A test. The next morning, he called me into his office. He had my story printed out on his desk. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation. "Sarah," he said, his expression unreadable. "I read your story." "And?" I asked, my voice tight. "It's very creative," he said slowly. "Really evocative. But I think there's a problem with the ending." He turned the printout around. He'd made edits. With a red pen. He had circled the final paragraph, the one describing the symbol. And in the margin, he had written, "Confusing. What is this? Let's replace with something more concrete." Maybe the protagonist decides to plant a community garden. A more hopeful note. I stared at his neat, red handwriting. Plant a garden. He had read my desperate message in a bottle, my scream into the void, and his only suggestion was to make it more hopeful. He hadn't understood. He couldn't understand. The contagion wasn't just erasing memory, it was erasing the ability to recognize the erasure. I left his office in a daze. I went to the online journal to look at my story again, to reassure myself that it was real. The page loaded. My name was there. The title was there. But the story had changed. The text was different. It was now a pleasant, meandering tale about a woman who rediscovers her love for her city by noticing the small details, the beauty in the mundane. The dread was gone. The confusion was gone. The symbol was gone. In its place was a final paragraph about planting a community garden. I scrolled to the comments section. There were a few. A beautiful, uplifting story about connection. What a hopeful message. I loved this. It's a great reminder to focus on the positive things. No one noticed. The story had been rewritten, its very essence hollowed out and replaced with bland sentimentality, and no one saw the difference. The fade had gotten to my words, my last refuge. It could reach into the digital world and change the past, seamlessly, silently. That's when I met Eleanor. She was a librarian in the rare books section, a place of hushed reverence, smelling of aging paper and leather binding. She was in her late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I had started spending more and more time there, finding a strange comfort in the solidity of the old, physical books. I was looking at an old city atlas from the 1950s, the names of streets and neighborhoods printed in elegant, confident ink. Pilsen. Wicker Park. Logan Square. They were all there. "It's a beautiful thing, isn't it?" a soft voice said beside me. It was Eleanor. She was looking at the atlas with me. "They knew what things were called back then," I said, my voice heavy. A flicker of something, recognition, sadness, passed through her eyes. It was a look I hadn't seen on another human face in months. "Yes," she said quietly. "Specificity is a fragile thing. We think of history as being written in stone, but it's really written on water." My heart stopped. I looked at her, truly looked at her. "You see it, don't you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Eleanor didn't answer directly. She just gave me a small, sad smile and gestured for me to follow her. She led me to a small, dusty backroom filled with books deemed too fragile for public handling. She pulled one from a shelf. It was a thin volume, bound in simple gray cloth. There was no title on the spine. She opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. And there, on the first page, drawn with meticulous care, was the symbol. The circle with the horizontal line. "A professor used to come in here, years ago," she said, her voice a low murmur. "A Dr. Finch. He was obsessed with what he called the Great Forgetting. He believed it would come like a thief in the night. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, collective sigh." I stared at the symbol in the book, then at her face. "You remember," I said. It wasn't a question. "I remember that I am forgetting," she corrected gently. "It's like trying to hold water in your hands. I can feel it slipping through my fingers. Names, dates. Yesterday, I couldn't remember the word for sonata. I knew the music in my head, but the word was just a puff of smoke." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a profound, weary sorrow. "You are young. Your memory is stronger. It must be very loud for you." "It's deafening," I admitted, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't alone. "What is the symbol?" "Finch called it the final placeholder," she said, tracing it with a frail finger. "The sigil for the unnamed. He believed it wasn't a cause, but a symptom. A gravestone erected by the subconscious for a memory that has been buried." We talked for an hour, our voices hushed in the dusty silence of the backroom. She was my first and only ally. For the first time, my terror had a companion. We made a plan. To meet every few days. To compare notes from my journal and her memory. To try and build a bulwark against the tide. I left the library that day feeling a sliver of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. 2 days later, I went back to the library for our scheduled meeting. I went to the rare books section, my heart light with anticipation. I found Eleanor at her desk, stamping a return slip on a book. "Eleanor," I said, smiling. "I found something about the symbol. On a water tower by the..." She looked up. Her eyes, which had held such sharp, weary intelligence, were placid. Calm. Unknowing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice polite and distant. "Have we met?" The blood drained from my face. I stared at her, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign of the woman who had remembered. There was nothing. The fade had taken her. It had washed over her memory, leaving behind this pleasant, professional shell. "No," I said, my voice hollow. "I'm sorry. I must have mistaken you for someone else." I turned and walked away, the hope that had bloomed within me curdling into ash. I hadn't just lost an ally. I had witnessed a soul being hollowed out in real time. The contagion wasn't just erasing the past. It was taking the people I knew and replacing them with strangers. The loss of Eleanor was a turning point. My investigation was no longer academic. It was a fight for my own sanity, my own existence. The symbol was the key. Finch had called it a symptom, a gravestone. But I was beginning to think it was more than that. It wasn't just marking the forgotten places, it was active. Its appearance preceded the deepest fades. It was a catalyst. Or a beacon. I dedicated myself to tracking it. My map of the city became a web of connections, the symbol at its center. The old courthouse, the symphony hall, the library, the forgotten statues. I started looking for a pattern, not in the locations themselves, but in what connected them. Ley lines of memory. I traced the paths on a map, and a shape began to emerge. A spiral, coiling inwards towards the heart of the city. At the center of that spiral was a location that made no sense. It wasn't a monument or a library or a museum. It was an old, decommissioned electrical substation on the edge of Goose Island, a forgotten piece of industrial Chicago, wedged between a modern data center and the murky waters of the canal. It was a place with no history, no culture, no public memory to erase. It was a blank space on the map. Or maybe, I thought with a jolt of ice in my veins, it wasn't a blank space. Maybe it was the source of the blankness. Getting in was easier than I expected. The chain-link fence was rusted through in one corner, and the main building was sealed with a simple padlock that I broke with a tire iron I bought from a hardware store. The cashier hadn't batted an eye. He was too busy watching a news report about the ongoing diplomatic talks with that one country across the ocean. The air inside the substation was thick, heavy, and silent. Not just quiet, but a profound, unnatural stillness. The kind of silence that absorbs sound. Dust lay thick on everything. A gray shroud over the colossal, dead transformers and switchgears that filled the main hall. They looked like idols to a forgotten god of energy. There was no one here. No cabal of villains, no mad scientists. But as I walked deeper into the cavernous space, I began to feel a strange pressure building in my head, a low, subsonic hum that was more a feeling than a sound. It was the feeling of uncreation. The feeling of static, of information being wiped. And in the very center of the hall, on the concrete floor, was the symbol. It wasn't painted or scratched into the surface. It was part of it. A perfect circle, 10 feet in diameter, with a line through its center, formed from a type of metal or stone that was blacker than anything I had ever seen. It didn't reflect the light from my flashlight, it drank it. It was a hole in the world. As I got closer, the pressure in my head intensified. My memories, my precious, hoarded memories, started to feel loose, unstable. I thought of the president's name, and for a terrifying second, it was gone. A complete blank. I had to physically grip the sides of my head, focusing, forcing the name back into my consciousness. It flickered there, fragile and faint, like a dying ember. I could feel the fade, the real fade, emanating from this spot. It wasn't a virus or a psychological trick. It was a force of nature. A fundamental law of this new reality. A conceptual black hole, sucking in the specificity of the world, leaving behind only vague archetypes. This was it. The confrontation. Not with a person, but with a principle. The principle of entropy, applied to meaning itself. I stared at the symbol, and a strange, seductive thought whispered through my mind. Let go. The thought was not my own. It was a soothing, gentle caress. It's so much work, remembering all those things. All those names, all those dates. They're just labels. They aren't the thing itself. Let them go. It's easier. It's more peaceful. I could feel it happening. The edges of my life, the sharp details, were beginning to blur. My sister's face, my first apartment, the name of the street I grew up on. They were dissolving into a warm, comfortable haze. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of calm. The placid, uncurious calm I saw in everyone else. It was a siren song. The promise of release. The freedom of not having to care. I saw myself standing there, my mind wiped clean, a blank slate. I would walk out of this substation and go back to the Chronicle. I would write my stories about the guy and that place. I would have coffee with Mark. I would call Amy and we would have a pleasant, meaningless conversation. I would be happy. I would be normal. I would be one of them. The thought was both terrifying and exquisitely tempting. To lay down the burden of being the only one who remembered. To finally rest. My hand went to the pocket of my jacket. My fingers closed around the small, hard rectangle of my journal. The Archive of the Lost. I pulled it out. The little black book felt impossibly heavy in my hand. It was the anchor that was holding me here, tethering me to a world that no longer existed. All I had to do was drop it. Let it fall into the dust. Let the silence take me. My thumb stroked the worn cover. Inside were the names. Led Zeppelin. Casablanca. Neil Armstrong. Pilsen. Eleanor. The President. His name. I held on to it, a mantra against the encroaching void. With a surge of defiance, a last, desperate flare of my former self, I opened the journal. I uncapped my pen. My hand was shaking, the pressure in my head immense. The silence was screaming. What are you doing? The silence seemed to whisper. There's no point. No one will ever read it. No one will ever know. Just let go. Maybe it was right. Maybe it was pointless. But it was my pointlessness. I knelt on the cold concrete, a few feet from the edge of the devouring symbol. I opened to a fresh page. The pen felt like a weapon, a tiny, defiant spear against an unstoppable force. And I began to write. I didn't write a story. I didn't write an exposé. I wrote a list. I wrote down every name. Every place, every song, every idea that I could drag from the depths of my besieged memory. I wrote my name. Sarah Jenkins. I wrote my sister's name. Amy Jenkins. I wrote my parents' names. I wrote the name of my first pet, a scruffy terrier named Patches. Each word was a struggle. Each letter was an act of war against the great, quiet nothingness. The pressure was immense. The lure of peace, of forgetting, was a physical pull. But for every concept that tried to slip away, I nailed it to the page with ink. I don't know how long I knelt there, writing in the dark, the only light from my flickering flashlight. Hours. A day. Time, like everything else, was losing its meaning. But I didn't stop. I filled one page, and then another. My handwriting grew sloppy, desperate. The journal became a shield, a testament. It was proof that I was here. That the world I knew was real. When I finally looked up, something had changed. The pressure in my head had not lessened, but my relationship to it was different. I had found a way to exist within it. To push back. The sun was rising. A sliver of gray light cut through a grimy window high on the substation wall. I was exhausted, drained, but I was still me. I closed the journal and put it back in my pocket. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I turned and walked out of the substation, back into the city. Nothing had been solved. The world was not fixed. The fade was still there, a permanent feature of the landscape now. But I had survived my pilgrimage to its source. I had faced the void and chosen to remember. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later. I am sitting in a cafe in a neighborhood that used to be called Lincoln Park. The sun is shining. People are laughing, talking. The world looks normal. But the headlines on the newspaper sitting on the table next to me tell a different story. Leader signs new bill. Good weather predicted for the big city. Local sports team has game today. The language of the world has become the language of a children's book. Simple. Vague. Safe. I don't work at the Chronicle anymore. I couldn't maintain the facade. I have a small apartment, a quiet job stocking shelves at a grocery store. I keep to myself. To everyone else, I am just a quiet woman. A little strange, maybe. A little lost in her own thoughts. They have no idea what a battlefield those thoughts are. Every day is a struggle. Every day, I fight the quiet contagion. It is a constant, gentle pressure to forget. Some days are harder than others. Sometimes I'll pick up a can of soup and forget the word for tomato. I'll have to stand there in the aisle, my eyes squeezed shut, fighting to retrieve it from the fog. But I have my weapon. I reach into my bag and pull out a small, black notebook, its cover soft with wear. It's not the first one. It's the fifth. When one is full, I seal it in a plastic bag and hide it with the others under the loose floorboard in my apartment. A library of a forgotten world. I open it to a new page. The man at the table next to me is talking to his friend. "I just finished a great book," he says. "You know, the one about the big white whale." A cold flicker of panic. I close my eyes. Moby Dick, I think. The name is there. Faint, but there. I open my eyes and pick up my pen. I write the date at the top of the page. Underneath it, I write the title of the book, the author's name. Another small victory. Another fact rescued from the fade. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if the fade will worsen, if one day I will wake up and not even remember my own name. I don't know if I am the only one left, or if there are other archivists like me, scattered across the globe, fighting their own lonely battles against the silence. But I know this. I have a choice. Every day, I can choose to let go, to float away on the placid sea of forgetfulness. Or I can choose to fight.